Chapter 36, Chapter 36 The Abandoned Castle. Chapter 36 The Abandoned Castle. Leaving from the northern gate of Pita City, the small convoy of 3 carriages passed through rows of suburban townhouses, weaving factories, and flour mills. Beyond them stretched open country, a clear river crossed by a narrow wooden bridge, and then a winding path that led into the forest. The road narrowed into a dirt trail, twisting between mossy trees and thick undergrowth. After an hour's travel, the forest finally broke, revealing a small town tucked within the embrace of the surrounding woods. From afar, the town appeared to rest in the shadow of a tall hill. Amidst the lush greenery, patches of white and reddish-brown rooftops dotted the landscape. A single curved road ran through the center, dividing the settlement in two, with houses neatly clustered along both sides. Around noon, thin trails of smoke rose lazily from the chimneys, curling into the sunlight. And there at the crest of the hill stood a black castle. Under the midday glow, its dark spires loomed like a relic from a forgotten age. The rising smoke from the town below drifted around it, cloaking it in a hazy shroud. The castle gleamed like a black pearl hidden in fog, beautiful, mysterious, and faintly ominous. That was their destination. The carriages rattled steadily along the uphill path, wheels crunching over uneven gravel. Each bump made the wooden frames creak, the sound echoing faintly between the trees. Villagers on the roadside stopped what they were doing to stare. Their clothes were plain, their eyes suspicious. As the black carriages rolled into town, whispers rippled from door to door. The townsfolk exchanged uneasy looks, muttering to one another. By the time the convoy reached the town square, it became clear they could go no further. It wasn't a matter of choice, there was simply no way through. The sight of sleek black horses and polished carriages had drawn too much attention. Within minutes, a crowd had formed, blocking the road. The air grew thick with hostility. "Get out of here! You don't belong in this town! Where do you think you're going? The castle! Don't let them near the castle!" Angry shouts erupted all at once. People surged forward, surrounding the carriages, waving their fists. The horses whinnied in panic, stamping their hooves against the cobblestones. Seeing no other choice, Charles and the others stepped out. 2 uniformed police officers pushed through the crowd to make way, with Charles walking calmly behind them. But the moment he appeared, the uproar only intensified. "It's him again! Leave! This isn't your land! Get out of here! Don't you dare set foot in that cursed castle!" Bang! One of the policemen raised his pistol and fired a single shot into the sky. The sharp crack echoed through the square, instantly silencing the mob. The smell of gunpowder lingered in the air. Charles cleared his throat lightly, glancing sideways at the officer beside him. "According to Doolan law," he asked evenly, "what's the penalty for obstructing police business?" "Anywhere from 10 pennies to 10 gold pounds, the young officer replied promptly. Charles recognized him, the same officer who'd once searched his house. Back then, the man had treated him like a suspect. Now, he followed like a lackey. Charles smirked faintly. "With this many people, I suppose the law won't punish them all, The crowd's tension seemed to ease for a moment until the young officer flashed a wicked grin. "Oh, it will," he said. "The chief loves a big crowd. More trouble means more fines." As he spoke, the other officers climbed down from the remaining carriages, 10 in total, all in matching dark uniforms, each holding a flintlock musket. The sight alone was enough to quiet the mob. One villager dared to shout something under his breath, then froze when another gunshot split the air. Silence fell once more. Unlike the peaceful societies of Earth, the kingdom of Doolan was far less restrained. Police here were the direct descendants of the city guard, the same enforcers who once ruled the streets like soldiers. They were men of power, feared and brutal, not afraid to shoot first and justify later. Even now, after a century of reform, they remained the law's iron fist. With the crowd subdued, the carriages rolled forward once more. The townspeople parted reluctantly, muttering curses under their breath. But the convoy didn't head straight for the castle. Instead, it stopped in front of a large, weathered house at the far end of the town. The earlier commotion had clearly drawn attention. Before long, an old man shuffled out of the building. His posture was hunched, his features sly and rat-like. Upon seeing Charles step down from the carriage, his face lit up with forced enthusiasm. "Ah, Lord Cranston! What an honor to have you in our humble town! Welcome, welcome!" Charles didn't bother with pleasantries. His expression was cold, his tone clipped. "The key." He extended a hand, eyes hard with impatience. The disdain in his voice was impossible to miss. The man before Charles was the current mayor of Canyon Town. If memory served, he'd been the loudest one cursing the old Cranston during the previous visit. Charles remembered him well, not for his courage, but for that freckled, bulbous, wine-stained nose of his, which twitched with every word he spoke like it had a life of its own. "The key?" "Had, of course, of course. I've had it ready for ages. Just a moment, I'll fetch it right away." Despite his claim, the mayor scurried back inside, rummaging noisily through drawers and cabinets. His babbling excuses and brazen shamelessness were so ridiculous that even the policemen nearby averted their eyes in disgust. Still, with Charles present, none of them said a word. After a short while, the old man came trotting back, both hands clutching a ring of heavy black iron keys. As he handed them over, he plastered on an oily grin. "You understand, of course, Hat, we were only following orders, nothing personal. You see, we just do what we're told. Hat. I hope you understand, truly understand." "Orders from who, exactly?" Charles asked, taking the keys slowly. His tone was casual, but his sidelong glance at the old weasel was sharp and disdainful. Any notion of respecting one's elders had long since evaporated. "Well, from the ones who, control the purse strings, Hat. You know how it is," the mayor said with a conspiratorial wink that made Charles's skin crawl. "The ones who control the money?" Charles thought grimly. "Tax officials? City council? Or perhaps someone else entirely?" He didn't press the issue. Pita City wasn't large, and there were only a handful of people who could command both the mayor and the chief of police. He already had a few names in mind, but until his strength grew, there was no point in speaking them aloud. One step at a time, he reminded himself quietly. Pocketing the keys, Charles climbed back into the carriage. The convoy started forward again, following the rocky road that wound toward the Black Castle. This time, there were no interruptions. The path curved gently upward, and before long, the castle gates loomed into view. They were not drawbridges but solid iron doors, locked tight and rusted at the edges. Through the narrow slats, Charles could see a courtyard blanketed in fallen leaves and overgrown weeds. Two spired towers flanked the gate like twin sentinels, their jagged silhouettes clawing at the grey sky. The surrounding walls of weathered stone rose 20 feet high, crumbling, scarred, and stripped of their outer plaster. It had clearly been decades since anyone cared for this place. The castle's design suggested it wasn't particularly ancient, more decorative than defensive, but its age and neglect gave it the weary dignity of an old man long past his prime. After some effort, the officers managed to turn the gate's manual crank, and the heavy doors creaked open inch by inch. The convoy stepped inside. The entrance hall was dim and cold. Past the archway lay a training yard surrounded by barracks, forges, and stables all long abandoned. Beyond another iron gate, they entered the heart of the castle, the inner keep. This was Black Maple Fort, the true seat of the Cranston family. The policemen looked around curiously, whispering to one another. The musty air, the cobwebbed rafters, the thick layer of dust, it was like stepping back in time. But Charles wasn't here for sightseeing. He fit one of the keys into the main hall's lock and forced open the heavy black door. The hinges groaned, and a wave of stale, cold air rolled out. Inside lay a vast, empty hall. Whatever furniture once stood there had been stripped away long ago. Only a massive stone fireplace remained, looming at the far end like a tomb monument. In one corner, a wide stone staircase wound upward to a second-floor gallery. From there, another stairway climbed toward the upper levels, vanishing beneath a ceiling covered in faded frescoes. Charles barely spared it a glance. Because the moment he stepped into the hall, a faint whisper brushed his ears. It wasn't wind. The sound was low, hushed like someone murmuring right beside him. The words were indistinct, their cadence eerily similar to the chants he used in spell casting. The tone carried a ghostly chill, and yet, inexplicably, something about it felt familiar. Unnervingly familiar. "What the hell?" he muttered. Before he realized it, his feet were moving on their own, drawn toward the source of the sound. It led him to a corner of the hall, a narrow passage with a stone railing and a flight of steps descending into the earth. A heavy wooden door barred the way at the bottom. The whisper grew louder. "Urgent." Beckoning. Charles felt his pulse quicken as if in trance, his body moving without thought. He was halfway down the steps when "Your spirituality is being invaded by an unknown force. Spellcasting abilities temporarily reduced." The glowing message flashed before his eyes. The shock snapped him back to awareness. He froze, glanced at the door below, then at the steps already behind him and turned on his heel, retreating without a second thought. As if angered by his resistance, the whisper suddenly rose in pitch, shrill and desperate. But now that he was alert, it no longer had any hold over him. "So this is what you call nothing unusual, hey?" he hissed under his breath, glaring back toward the stairway. The police officers in the main hall, still oblivious, chatted idly among themselves. Charles clenched his fists. "If this is considered safe," he muttered darkly, "I'd hate to see what counts as dangerous." His curiosity was gone. Whatever fascination he'd had with the castle vanished entirely. He had no interest in living here now, certainly not in a place that whispered like it had a mind of its own. If someone wanted to play ghost hunter, they could have it. As for him, he'd seen enough. Heading upstairs, he searched through the third-floor study. Dust blanketed the furniture, but after a long search, he found what he came for, the Cranston family sigil, the official token of dominion over Kenyon Town. Tucking it safely away, Charles left the castle without looking back. Chapter 37, Chapter 37 Arrival at the Destination. Chapter 37 Arrival at the Destination. "I'm terribly sorry, Mr. Cranston," said the clerk behind the counter with a stiff smile. "President Seth, who oversees noble investiture ceremonies, is currently away from Pita City. You'll have to wait a while longer." "How long?" Charles asked flatly. "We're uncertain when the president will return. And there's no one else who can perform the ceremony in his place." "I'm afraid not. According to royal law, a noble inheritance must be officiated personally by the President of the Nobility Welfare and Administration Council." That same reply word for word was what Charles heard for more than 10 days straight. At first, he'd suspected that this so-called Doolan Nobility Welfare and Management Association, the government body responsible for such procedures, was deliberately delaying his title confirmation. After all, bureaucracy was an art form in itself, and stalling a minor noble was hardly unusual. But upon further inquiry, he learned that President Seth truly had left Pita City. The man was attending the 7th National Conference on Institutional Reform and Governance, a grand assembly hosted by the Doolan Kingdom. Every influential noble and municipal leader in the nation was required to participate. Naturally, that excluded Charles, who, for now, was still only a baron in name. His formal inheritance, like everything else in this kingdom, would have to wait. The Great Royal Conference, as rumor had it, was focused on a particularly controversial topic: the reauthorization of private noble armies. The entire city had been buzzing with debate. Ordinary citizens, predictably, were vehemently opposed. The noble class, though Charles hadn't mingled among them recently, would no doubt be on the opposite side of the argument. After all, where one sits determines how one thinks. It was an eternal truth of politics. The commoners feared a return to the old days, the magnification of power for a class already drenched in privilege. The nobles, on the other hand, had their own reasoning. This was not a peaceful world. Private armies, they claimed, were necessary to ensure the safety of their families and their people. Their people, hey? Charles thought dryly. They mean themselves. This wasn't the Middle Ages. Nobles no longer ruled vast fiefs, at least, not officially. So then, what do they even need the police for? He muttered, shaking his head. It wasn't his problem. Politics bored him to death. Better to spend that time studying spells than listening to nobles argue about who deserved more power. One moment he was in a city reminiscent of early 19th century Europe, the next, he found himself once more in a world that smelled of iron, salt, and medieval superstition. He blinked, letting his eyes adjust to the dim room around him. Everything was exactly as he'd left it: dark furniture, scattered papers, the faint scent of seawater seeping through the walls. Outside the porthole windows, a rolling mist cloaked the endless ocean. Judging by the faint orange hue of the sky, it was around 6 in the evening, dinner time for most, the start of night for sailors and merchants alike. But Charles neither needed sleep nor food. Having rested in the front world, he felt alert and refreshed. With no entertainment aboard the ship, he sat down at the small desk, drew out a stack of blank paper and ink he'd brought with him, and began practicing arcane sigils, the secret scripts of magic. Paper here was a luxury. True paper-making hadn't been developed in this world. Scholars used parchment or coarse toilet-grade pulp, and every book was handwritten unique, precious, and rare. Knowledge here was literally bound in skin. And parchment, made from treated animal hide, was expensive. Every page mattered. So Charles had taken to bringing reams of paper from the modern world whenever he crossed over. Even then, it was a hassle. He pushed aside those thoughts and began sketching again, lines of strange angular script forming on the page like a fusion of runes and oracle bone carvings. His pen strokes were surer now, his characters neater than when he first started. Tonight's focus was a spell called Touch of Fatigue. Unlike the Curse of Pain, it required no alchemical reagents or ritual components, only the correct sequence of sigils and a brief incantation. Once written and memorized, it could be cast freely. From his earlier conversation with the old clockmaker, Charles had learned that these symbols, arcane scripts, or secret texts, were the foundation of all true magic. Every spellcaster had to learn them, and many higher-tier spells simply couldn't function without them. The old man hadn't explained much else, but one thing had been clear: the more complex the magic, the more inevitable the script. Time slipped by. Darkness swallowed the sea. The waves, once roaring, now murmured softly against the hull, their rhythm like a lullaby. Charles's quill scratched on, the pile of completed sheets growing steadily. Crumpled failures littered the floor, paper balls tossed carelessly into corners. The once tidy cabin had turned into a scholar's battlefield. By the time he drew the final line, his hand trembled and his eyes burned. He leaned back, exhaling, blinking away the faint golden stars that danced across his vision. "Maybe a walk will help," he muttered. Through the foggy window, the night looked calm and enticing. He stood, stretched, and left the cabin known among the sailors, half jokingly and half fearfully, as the ghost room. The night air was cold and briny, biting against his skin. But it was refreshing. Leaning against the railing, he felt the exhaustion begin to ebb. His mind cleared. Soon, his thoughts drifted back to plans for the future. His goals were clear: grow stronger, hunt monsters, gain combat experience, and harvest souls to master the 3 disguise spells. Then, finish learning the remaining 4 spells in his notebook. A battlefield would be perfect for that, if only it weren't so suicidal. And there was, of course, the tag-along. Polite, deferential, almost flattering, but Charles trusted her about as far as he could throw her. She claimed to be a messenger of the King of Light, descended from heaven to guide him. Only an idiot would buy that. And Charles did not consider himself an idiot. He was still lost in thought when a lively female voice piped up behind him. He didn't need to turn around to know who it was. "Hey, can you teach me that little doll stabbing trick of yours?" "You're too stupid to learn it," he said without looking back. "I'm not stupid. I made all your dolls, remember? They're hideous. You have no right to brag. You said the looks didn't matter. They do when they burn my retinas." "Humph. You're just stingy." The girl Arya huffed, then leaned on the railing beside him, mimicking his posture without an ounce of grace. "Still," she mused aloud, "when I master the water dance techniques that Master Sirio taught me, silent as shadow, swift as a deer, you won't even see me coming. I'll tug your hair before you can react. With your sickly little body?" "I'll believe it when I see it," Charles said, feigning disdain. "I am not sickly," Arya snapped. "It's Sansa's fault. She made me eat oranges on the ship, and you know I'm allergic." "Then why did you eat them?" "I forgot." Charles couldn't help a faint smirk. Their banter passed the time easily, and before long, the black horizon began to change. Faint lights flickered in the distance, the outline of a coastline coming into view. As the ship drew nearer, those lights grew brighter, until a bustling port emerged from the mist, shimmering under lantern glow. Arya gasped in excitement, pointing ahead. "Look! We're here! That's White Harbor City! The Manderley's domain!" Charles followed her gaze, watching the harbor grow larger, clearer. After half a month at sea, they had finally arrived at their destination, the White Harbor Castle, seat of the Manderley family, along the northern coast of the Seven Kingdoms' northern frontier. Their long voyage had come to an end. Chapter 38, Chapter 38, A Lesson at the Docks. Chapter 38, A Lesson at the Docks. As the ship neared the port, the torchlight from the pier grew brighter, illuminating a crowd of waiting figures. Faces once hazy in the distance gradually became clear under the flickering glow, stern, curious, or barely restrained with emotion. "Look! That's my brother, Rob. See him? The red-haired one in front. And that's great Jan Umber of House Umber, he's fierce, but father likes him. Over there, Lady Maege Mormont. The only female lord under father's banner. Where's Theon? And Uncle Howland Reed? I don't see him anywhere." Arya's voice rose higher and higher, her excitement impossible to contain. Her joy was pure and unguarded happiness at seeing familiar faces again. Her cheerful shouting drew attention from below deck. The other passengers, who had barely slept, began to emerge one by one to glimpse the port drawing near. Even Eddard Stark himself, so often solemn, allowed a faint smile to cross his face. The dock was alive with movement, northern lords standing in a line, led by Robb Stark, the young Lord of Winterfell, here to welcome his father home. It was almost like the scene Charles had witnessed at Dragonstone: nobles, family, loyalty, reunion, all the trappings of the highborn. Watching from the rail, Charles couldn't help thinking drily, must be nice being a great lord. Everywhere you go, there's always someone waiting to greet you. While those aboard shouted and waved, the people on the dock noticed the incoming ship as well. Their faces were lit by firelight, flickering with excitement, restraint, and expectation. Especially the tall young man at the front, his red-brown curls gleamed in the light, his blue eyes wide with anticipation. Even from afar, Charles could see the struggle on his face, the effort to appear composed despite his joy. The ship slowed, the ropes were cast, and the gangway was lowered. Eddard Stark descended first, limping slightly. The moment his boots touched the pier, a cheer rose from the crowd. "Lord Stark! Your Grace! Father!" They surged forward, surrounding him in warmth and relief. Arya and Sansa ran ahead, throwing themselves into Rob's arms, their laughter and tears mingling in the cold sea air. It was the perfect family picture, pure, heartfelt, and whole. Charles, standing off to the side, was watching with mild amusement when a voice greeted him unexpectedly. "Ah, a stranger among the wolves, are you? Welcome to the north." Charles turned. A middle-aged nobleman stood beside him, well-groomed, dressed neatly, his beard trimmed and his smile broad. "A northern lord come to greet Eddard Stark. His clothes are tidy. He looks like a clean man, a rarity among medieval nobles." Charles didn't know him, but out of courtesy, he reached out and shook the man's extended hand. And immediately regretted it. The grip that met his palm was too strong, crushing almost to the point of pain. The smile on the man's face didn't match the hostility in his fingers. Charles's brow furrowed. He glanced toward Eddard, still busy being smothered by his retainers, and narrowed his eyes. His lips parted slightly, and a faint whisper escaped. It wasn't speech. It was chanting. The words slithered like smoke. A chill crept through the air, subtle but wrong. At first, the Lord Roderick Castle of the Winterfell didn't react. He kept smiling, though his eyes flickered uncertainly. But soon, his expression shifted. The hand gripping Charles's suddenly went cold. The frost seeped beneath his glove, crawling up his wrist like ice water. His breath hitched. Then came the fatigue, sudden, bone-deep, as though his strength was being quietly drained away. The spell was gentle, almost delicate, but relentless. Roderick's posture sagged. His breathing grew ragged. His knees trembled. Sweat beaded on his forehead as his chest heaved with effort. It was only when the nobleman let out a strangled gasp and stumbled back that the others noticed. All eyes turned toward the sound. And there they saw him, the once proud and loud lord of House Castle, now bent over, gasping for air on his knees, pale as ash. The northern lords bristled instantly. "Gods, he's a witch! What have you done to him, sorcerer? Boy! Let go of him at once!" As several men stormed forward, Charles stopped the incantation and casually released his grip. Without support, the exhausted lord collapsed onto the dock, coughing violently, clutching his chest as though just escaping death's jaws. Eddard pushed through the angry crowd, raising a hand for silence. His voice was low but sharp. "Enough! Everyone stand down!" He turned to Charles, his expression a mix of disappointment and bewilderment. He had warned the boy explicitly not to flaunt his sorcery in public. And now, the very moment they arrived, Charles had chosen to hex one of his own allies. Was he mad? Charles only shrugged. Then, under the torchlight, he raised his hand. Across his pale skin, bright red finger marks stood out clearly, evidence of the noble's earlier aggression. The gathered lords exchanged uncertain looks. Their fury faltered, shame flickering behind their eyes. Eddard's jaw tightened. Rob's lips pressed thin. Both men understood immediately. Not all who kneel to the wolf are true to the pack. Charles smirked faintly. Seems not everyone in the north marches to the same tune as House Stark. The incident at the docks was over almost as soon as it began, no more than a brief wave before the sea returned to calm. But it left ripples. From that day forward, Lord Roderick Castle avoided Charles like the plague, refusing even to meet his eyes. Everyone else, meanwhile, treated the quiet sorcerer from the south with a great deal more caution. Where before there had been suspicion, now there was courtesy. During introductions, even those who had cursed at him earlier apologized with stiff smiles. From the outside, there was no sign of resentment or hostility, only uneasy respect. It baffled Charles. He'd half expected some arrogant noble to provoke him again just so he could slap them down figuratively or otherwise, but nothing of the sort happened. Then again, it made sense. No sane man would provoke a mysterious black sorcerer who had just humiliated a northern lord and who, apparently, had saved Lord Stark's life. No one wanted to test how deep that darkness went. Was that earlier, aimed at the Starks? Charles asked at last, glancing at the riders surrounding them as the group made its way through the torch-lit road leading away from the harbour. Everyone around them seemed genuinely happy about Eddard's return, cheerful, loyal, even proud. There was no trace of deceit or ill will. That only deepened his confusion. If the handshake incident had been a test, surely it implied hostility, didn't it? So why did it now feel like it had all been some harmless formality? Before he could puzzle it out, someone answered him. "They are my father's bannermen," said a calm, measured voice beside him. A young man with chestnut red hair had quietly drawn his horse up alongside Charles's. His eyes were steady, his tone thoughtful. "They serve the Starks, yes, but they are also proud lords of their own lands. Don't take offense to what happened earlier, it was a test, but without malice." He continued evenly, "With the sorcerer of your caliber aiding House Stark, our strength grows considerably. It's only natural for our vassals to wonder what that means for them, and how they should deal with such a man in the future." "So, they were testing my strength," Charles said with a faint smirk. "Exactly. Northern men are straightforward. Subtlety isn't in our nature." The young man inclined his head politely. "I'm Rob. Rob Stark. My sisters told me what happened in King's Landing. Thank you for saving my father." Charles followed Rob's gaze to where Arya and Sansa were riding a short distance away, whispering to each other but clearly keeping an eye on him. He gave a small shrug. "I thought I just had one of those faces that people naturally hate." "Faces that people hate?" Rob repeated, puzzled by the odd phrase. Still, seeing the humor in Charles's eyes, he relaxed and smiled. Up close, the two looked to be around the same age, yet everything about them felt different. Rob carried himself with the measured discipline of a young lord, calm, self-assured, burdened by duty. Charles, by contrast, moved with a casual, almost modern irreverence, his words light, his posture careless. They weren't just from different worlds. They were from different eras. Even so, conversation came easily. Rob was eager to hear every detail of how Charles had rescued his father in King's Landing, while Charles found himself curious about this young wolf, the boy who, in another tale, would one day be both a general and a martyr. They talked idly as their horses clopped along the cobbled streets of Coldwater City, laughter and banter weaving through the night. And yet, beneath Rob's calm tone, Charles caught something else, a faint, hidden note of melancholy. He couldn't help but wonder. Was it the loss of command now that his father had returned? Or something deeper, something unspoken? He didn't press the issue. But he noticed how the lords ahead crowded around Eddard, hanging on his every word, leaving Rob quietly trailing behind them, his smile fading, his eyes thoughtful. The contrast was telling. Their small procession continued through the narrow, stone-paved streets of Coldwater. The town's flickering lanterns cast long shadows over the riders as laughter echoed from the men up front. The northern lords exchanged booming jokes and slaps on the back, the sound of camaraderie filling the chilly air. Charles, riding with the younger Starks, let the rhythm of the conversation drift over him, idle talk of hunting, weather, and home. But their light-hearted chatter was abruptly cut short. From ahead came the rapid thunder of hooves. The seasoned lords stiffened at once, turning toward the sound. Torches flared. Shadows leapt along the walls. Moments later, a lone rider burst out of the darkness, his horse lathered with sweat. He wore leather armor, streaked with mud and blood. He barely noticed who he was addressing as he dismounted and half fell to one knee before one of the leading lords. "Urgent news," he gasped, voice hoarse. "The Lannister army launched a surprise attack in the night. Our forces couldn't hold them. Riverrun has fallen." A stunned silence followed. "What? Riverrun? Fallen? That's impossible. The Freys are entrenched there. You must be joking." "Seven hells, it can't be true." The crowd erupted in disbelief. Faces turned pale, voices overlapped. But reason whispered a truth they didn't want to hear. Messengers didn't lie about things like this. If Riverrun had indeed fallen, then the situation was catastrophic. That fortress guarded the Trident, the great river that split Westeros north to south. It was the only secure passage between the north and the southern kingdoms. If the city had fallen, the Stark armies would be trapped, cut off from the south entirely. Eddard's voice broke through the rising panic, calm but grim. Who led the attack? The messenger lifted his head, eyes wide as he recognized the man before him. He swallowed hard and bowed deeply. It was the Lannisters' dwarf, my Lord Tyrion Lannister himself. Lord Stark. The words hit like a hammer. Even the night wind seemed to freeze. Chapter 39, Chapter 39. A shift in the balance. Chapter 39. A shift in the balance. The phrase of the twins may have sent men to aid us against the Lannisters, but that cautious old Valder Frey never commits his full strength. Their defenses inside the city were still formidable. How could Riverrun fall so easily? The time frame doesn't make sense. Too short. Lord Bolton was stationed at the crossroads, not far from the Trident. The terrain between is flat. He should have been able to send reinforcements if the city was under siege. Exactly. What was Bolton doing? You can't blame Lord Bolton entirely. What if the Lannisters had used Riverrun as bait to strike our main camp instead? Still, preserving the Lord's safety is our top priority. I'd very much like to know whose brilliant idea it was to abandon the army and come all the way here to welcome me, Eddard said coldly. The edge in his tone was unmistakable. The gathered lords exchanged awkward looks, no one daring to speak first. After a moment, Robb finally stepped forward, voice low but steady. Father, we had just lifted the siege of Riverrun and captured Jaime Lannister himself. None of us expected Tywin would respond so boldly or that he could act so quickly. As for why so many came here, he trailed off, clearly embarrassed. The reason was obvious but unsaid. Eddard's eyes narrowed slightly. Of course he understood. Every lord wanted to be the first to pay homage to the returning Warden of the North, politics disguised as loyalty. And now, because of that foolish display, their military advantage had vanished overnight. The old wolf said nothing further, but his clenched jaw and furrowed brow said enough. The mood soured instantly. Within minutes, they abandoned the plan to rest overnight in cold water. Eddard curtly thanked the local lord, ordered the horses saddled, and gave the command to march. Outside the city stretched a rugged coastal road, winding between jagged hills and cliffs that overlooked the misty sea. The moonlight made the path treacherous, slick with salt and gravel, but the northern lords were skilled riders, they pressed on without hesitation. For the women and attendants, Charles among them, it was rougher going. Fortunately, there were enough mounted soldiers to help them along. By dawn, the tired column finally reached the crossroads encampment, a massive sprawl of tents spread across a flat plain where several trade routes converged. Fog drifted across the field, shrouding the camp in a pale haze, but even through it Charles could see movement everywhere, soldiers bustling, banners flapping, the restless cries of horses splitting the morning air. The atmosphere was heavy, urgent, chaotic. Once inside the camp, Charles could feel the tension pressing down like a physical weight. Everyone was too busy to spare a glance for him. He, Melisandre in her red robes, and the rest of House Stark's household were hastily shown to a row of tents at the rear. Whatever the details of the battle, even an outsider could tell the Northern Army was in trouble. Charles decided not to interfere. He settled quietly into his tent, expecting to be ignored for the rest of the day. But it wasn't long before a soldier arrived, breathless and deferential, inviting him to the main command tent. The man didn't know why the nobles had summoned the young sorcerer, but Charles did. And sure enough, the moment he stepped through the tent flaps, the question came at once. "Sir Cranston," said one of the lords sharply, "do you have any means, any magic that could threaten the Lannisters holding Riverrun?" Charles let his gaze sweep across the war table. Every face he'd seen at the harbor was there plus several new ones. They were all staring at him, expectant, curious, doubtful, calculating. He could feel their conflicting thoughts, hope and suspicion mingled in equal measure. His eyes flicked briefly toward the head of the table, where Eddard Stark sat in silence, long face grave. Then, in a voice calm and confident, Charles answered. If you can bring me a strand of the city commander's hair, I can make him open the gates for you. The room fell still. He didn't sound boastful, merely matter of fact. Certain. But behind that certainty lay another truth he didn't believe for a second they could manage it. This wasn't the complacent, soft-hearted King's Landing. This was war. The enemy's fortress was locked down under siege protocols, communication cut off. Even if they had an insider, it wouldn't matter. And as for sneaking someone inside? Charles's gaze drifted toward the distant silhouette of Riverrun barely visible beyond the fog, a city of stone and water, its towers gleaming faintly in the morning light. Anyone who tries to get close, he thought, will be turned into a pincushion before they reach the gates. Just as Charles expected, his blunt answer deflated the entire tent. When he admitted that he needed something as specific as a lock of the enemy commander's hair, disappointment rippled through the war council. Whatever excitement had filled their eyes moments earlier quickly died out. Reluctantly, they shelved the idea of winning the siege through sorcery, and the meeting resumed its more mundane pace. Lord Bolton's probing attack last night didn't breach their defences, one lord began, but it did reveal much about Riverrun's fortifications. If we strike with the full host, they can't possibly hold. Another chimed in, indeed. The old lion's main army is still in the Riverlands. He wouldn't have left his whelp much to defend with. But Riverrun's position is naturally strong, came a deeper voice. To take it would require time, and that's the one thing we don't have. The Trident to the north, Harrenhal to the east, King's Landing in the south, and the Westerlands to the west, the Riverlands are completely encircled. Tywin's strategy is ruthless but brilliant. The Tullus can't hold out for long. We can't let that happen, someone shouted. We must retake Riverrun at once. And how do you propose we do that? Another snapped. Do you know how many lives that will cost? Even if we win, will there still be a Riverlands left to save? Lady Catelyn and the entire Tully family are trapped inside. We can't just abandon them. Of course not, but how do you expect us to reach them? The tent filled with heated voices, overlapping arguments, and weary sighs. Then someone raised the question everyone had been thinking. How in the Seven Hells did the imp take Riverrun in the first place? According to the few Freys who survived, a commander said grimly, the imp conspired with one of old Valder Frey's sons. During a feast, the son poisoned his kin, then opened the gates for the Lannisters. Clearly, it was a plan long in the making, but I'd wager Tywin's hand was behind it. What you mean Lord Valder Frey was poisoned by his own son? A chorus of disbelief erupted. Which idiot thought killing his father would make him lord of the twins? Fools, all of them. But even the stupidest Frey knows one thing: the Lannisters always repay their debts. That last sentence silenced the room. Several lords exchanged uneasy glances before one pale, clean-shaven man muttered coldly. Valder Frey lived too long anyway. The lords of the north found themselves powerless, forced to watch their ally swallowed by the Lannisters' trap while they stood helplessly outside the noose. The camp turned feverishly busy overnight, messengers galloping between tents, soldiers drilling non-stop, and scouts departing before dawn. Yet, in the midst of this chaos, Charles was oddly idle. He had saved Eddard's life and held a reputation of strange power, but this was war, brute, bloody war, and there was little room for a solitary sorcerer in the machinery of strategy and supply. Since that first council meeting, he hadn't seen Eddard again. The Lord's command tent burned with candlelight late into every night, filled with grim-faced nobles and maps covered in tokens of battle. Charles watched from a distance, noting the constant flow of men coming and going, soldiers leaving fully armed, knights returning exhausted and bloodstained. The rhythm of it all felt strangely familiar. Half a month ago, he'd been in the same position, stuck on the sidelines, forgotten while the powerful decided the fate of nations. The only difference now was freedom. At least here, he could move as he pleased. There were attendants to guide him through the sprawling camp, unlike Dragonstone, where he'd wandered blind and unwelcome. And there was Arya. Unlike her prim and proper sister, Arya Stark couldn't sit still for more than 5 minutes. Every day, she would sneak into Charles's tent, full of restless energy and unending questions. Sometimes she asked about his magic. Sometimes about his mysterious past. And sometimes she just waved her wooden sword, practicing her so-called water dance moves in front of him with mock seriousness, though her pride was impossible to miss. Charles didn't bother hiding his spell work from her. In turn, to kill time, he'd share bits and pieces of stories from his previous life, legends, fables, even mundane tales. Unfortunately, it only fueled the girl's curiosity. Soon she was following him everywhere like an overeager shadow. By the 3rd day, Charles was beginning to regret ever opening his mouth. The Red Priestess, on the other hand, was the exact opposite. Melisandre kept entirely to her tent, emerging neither for food nor sunlight. No one knew what she was doing, and that secrecy only made Charles more suspicious. Something about her unnerved him, a quiet, calculated purpose that had nothing to do with the war outside. But for now, he had neither time nor patience to deal with her. Eddard, owing to his friendship with Stannis, treated her politely enough. Outside, the world moved fast. The Lannisters, the Starks, the battles at the crossroads and Riverrun, everything in this bloody continent called Westeros seemed to accelerate toward chaos. All because one man, Eddard Stark, had uncovered the truth that King Robert's children were not his own, and hesitated. That single moment of mercy had cost the realm its balance. Now, with Robert dead, his brothers Stannis and Renly raised banners of their own, each claiming the throne. The North marched to avenge their lord. And the world burned for it. Charles, the outsider, had nudged the timeline in small but irreversible ways. But for him, it didn't matter much. He barely remembered how the original story even went. So he filled his days with spell practice, idle talk, and the occasional attempt to spy on the Red Woman's tent, never successfully. 3 uneventful days passed this way. At first, he was content to relax. By the 4th day, boredom began gnawing at him. He hadn't crossed worlds just to sit around on vacation. That night, after yet another war council broke up, Charles decided enough was enough. He slipped out under the cover of darkness, making his way toward the command tent to find Eddard Stark himself. Some crowns are as light as feathers, others as heavy as mountains. And King Robert's green crown of horns and betrayal weighed heavy enough to tip the fate of all Westeros. Chapter 40, Chapter 40, Practice and the Night Raid. Chapter 40, Practice and the Night Raid. I've already arranged for you to leave with Sansa and the others the day after tomorrow, said Eddard Stark, not looking up from his desk. The front lines are too dangerous. You shouldn't be here. Inside the dim command tent, the candlelight flickered across maps, scrolls, and a dozen letters spread before the Lord of Winterfell. Dressed now in a rough brown leather cuirass instead of his noble furs, his face looked older, grey stubble creeping across his jaw, eyes hollow from sleepless nights. Charles blinked, caught off guard. Wait, are you seriously sending me away like I'm some sick old man? He hadn't even been inside 2 minutes before hearing that. Sure, he wasn't exactly a battle-hardened warrior, but frail civilian felt like an insult. War is no child's game, Eddard said, glancing up briefly before returning to his letter. From what I've heard, your sorcery isn't suited for the battlefield. It's suited well enough to keep me alive, Charles countered. Eddard's quill froze mid-word. Can it protect you when 10,000 men charge at once? Okay, he had a point. The silence lingered until Eddard sighed and softened his tone. I don't know what you truly seek, nor what path you intend to take. But you saved my life in King's Landing without asking for reward. I cannot, in good conscience, let that debt go unpaid. The least I can do is ensure your safety." He finally set down the quill and looked Charles in the eye. "Go north with Arya and Sansa. Return to Winterfell. It's far safer there. Here." His gaze drifted toward the tent flap, beyond which the sounds of the camp shouts, hooves, and clattering armor filled the night air. "Here, I can't even promise to protect my own life." Charles said nothing. Because, truthfully, Eddard wasn't wrong. Among thousands of hardened soldiers, his magic strange, misunderstood, untested wouldn't change the tide of battle. He might survive a duel, but not a war. And yet, safety was never his goal. If he'd wanted safety, he could have stayed in the world before the door, a world of order and reason, dull but stable. There, he could have drifted through life unnoticed, clinging to mediocrity until the end. But instead, he was here in a land ruled by swords and fire. Because he couldn't stomach helplessness. Because the only way to survive between two worlds was to grow strong enough to walk them both. "Then I'll compromise," Charles said at last, tone casual but firm. "I won't serve as infantry. But I could be an archer." "That's less dangerous, right?" Eddard frowned. "Less dangerous doesn't mean safe." "True," Charles agreed, smirking faintly. "But if you don't approve, I might just go on my own anyway." That earned him a long, heavy stare. For a moment, neither spoke. The only sound was the scratching of quill against parchment and the faint whistle of wind outside the tent. Eddard's expression didn't change, but Charles could tell he understood. He wasn't a man who begged to live quietly in the shadows. He'd already chosen the path that walked beside death. "I know you mean well," Charles continued, his voice calm but resolute, "but sometimes, good intentions only make things worse." He met Eddard's gaze squarely, eyes steady, expression earnest. "You said you didn't know what I wanted," he said. "Then let me make it clear I want to stay here. If you truly wish to repay that debt you mentioned, then don't send me away. Just make sure I can stay alive here." A faint smile curved his lips. "And if I die, well, don't feel guilty about it. It'll be my own damn fault, won't it?" The tent fell silent. Eddard studied him for several long moments, his brows knit tight. Finally, he sighed and gave a slow nod. "Very well," he said at last. "You may remain here and I'll place you with the archers. But on one condition." Charles raised a brow. "Which is?" "You'll undergo proper training. You'll drill and learn as they do. I won't have you slowing anyone down." Charles grinned. "No problem." That was the end of their talk. As the commander of an entire northern host, Eddard had no time for drawn-out discussions. His duties consumed every waking hour, planning, writing, commanding, often well past midnight. So Charles, wise enough not to overstay, took his leave. He'd assumed it would take several days before anything came of their conversation. To his surprise, the very next afternoon a servant appeared at his tent. "Your training begins immediately, my lord," the young man said politely. "Lord Stark insisted you not train with the common soldiers. It would be improper treatment for a guest of your stature." Charles nearly laughed. "Yeah, that sounds like something one of the nobles decided on their own," he thought. Eddard's too practical for that kind of nonsense. Still, he didn't mind. Group training might teach coordination, but one-on-one instruction? That meant faster progress. And so began the strange sight of a sorcerer learning archery. Draw the string smoothly. Use your index, middle, and ring fingers to hook it. Keep the arrow on the left side of the bow. Now steady. The most important thing on the battlefield is to follow orders. But as an archer, your first priority is survival. Always watch your surroundings. Eyes, bow, and target one straight line. Draw slowly. When you loose, don't jerk the string. Let it go naturally. Too much force ruins your aim. The instructor, a wiry, sharp-featured soldier named Rorel, spoke with the patience of a man who'd trained 100 recruits. Charles listened carefully, mimicking each motion. And as he practiced, faint messages shimmered at the edge of his vision. You listen attentively to Soldier Rorel's lecture on projectile mechanics. Your archery skill has improved slightly. You study Rorel's demonstration of aiming techniques. Your archery skill has improved slightly. You attempt your first live shot. Your archery proficiency increases. And so it went, learning, drilling, shooting until an entire week slipped by unnoticed. In the world before the door, nothing of importance happened. Charles ate, slept, and occasionally stopped by the Nobility Welfare and Administration Council in Pita City to ask about the elusive President Seth. Every time, he got the same answer, no word of his return. So he focused all his time here training his aim, refining his spells. He'd nearly mastered 2 of them now. The barracks provided endless practice materials, rats, crows, and the occasional dead livestock, enough for his bone resurrection to reach 99% proficiency. But then, nothing. No matter how much he practiced, progress stopped cold. Maybe there's a step I'm missing, he muttered, flipping through his black notebook for the 100th time. No luck. It confirmed his suspicion, the book only recorded basic spells. The last few sealed pages, those containing the disguise incantations, were clearly on a different level altogether. As for any mention of the notebook's origin or the mysterious possession incident that once connected it to him, there was nothing. Either the information was sealed or it had never been there at all. Cautious as ever, Charles decided not to pry deeper. For now, he devoted himself to practice archery by day, spellcraft by night. His progress was startling. The eye of true sight ability corrected every tiny flaw in his movements, letting him improve faster than any normal student could. Rorel, his instructor, often stared at him in open disbelief, muttering that no one in his 20 years of service had learned so fast. Yet, no matter how much he advanced, there was still no talk of actual combat. Charles began to suspect Eddard meant to keep him training safely until the war was long over. A week after their talk, frustration got the better of him. He went to find Eddard again, only to discover the Lord was out inspecting defenses. Grumbling under his breath, he trudged back toward his tent. And then he heard it. A deep, thunderous rumble beneath the quiet night. Hoofbeats. Dozens. Hundreds. Charles froze, head snapping toward the sound. His eyes widened as the ground itself began to tremble. Out of the darkness, under the cold gleam of the moon, surged a sea of cavalry armored riders thundering straight toward the camp. No warning horns. No signal fires. They hit the outer perimeter without slowing down. And at their head, lit by the flicker of torches and the silvery light of night, a crimson banner whipped in the wind embroidered with a golden lion rearing on its hind legs. The sigil of House Lannister. Charles's blood ran cold. The night had just been shattered by fire, steel, and the roar of a Lannister raid. Chapter 41, Chapter 41 Growth amid Chaos. Chapter 41 Growth amid Chaos. The chaos struck without warning. One moment, the camp was quiet beneath the moonlight, still, heavy with the stench of horse dung and smoke. The next, it was as if hell itself had descended upon them. A thunderous crash shattered the night. The outer barriers splintered under the impact of charging cavalry, and a wave of armored riders poured into the camp like a flood. Screams erupted everywhere. Horses shrieked, tents caught fire, and the crackling of burning canvas mixed with the clash of steel and dying men. Within seconds, the night was ablaze, fire spreading like the wings of some vengeful god. 2,000 soldiers had been stationed here, but unprepared, they might as well have been lambs before the slaughter. Charles saw one northern soldier's skull crushed by a flail, his scream abruptly cut off. Another lunged with a spear at a rider's horse, only to take an arrow in the back from a second knight before being decapitated mid-collapse. Men scrambled into their tents for cover, only to be driven out moments later by the spreading fire straight into waiting blades. The ground turned slick with blood and ash, bodies were trampled into the mud until they were little more than pulp. The wind fanned the inferno, turning the tightly packed camp into a blazing death trap. In that sea of flame, the attackers looked like demons' faces lit crimson by the fire, laughter echoing over the screams of the dying. It was a massacre. Women from the supply corps shrieked as they ran, and the Northmen roared in futile resistance. The Lannister cavalry grew only wilder in response, their laughter ringing out over the carnage. They were no true knights, just beasts in armor. Their fine horses and gilded armor couldn't hide the savagery in their eyes. When the first screams erupted, Charles was already moving. He slipped back into his tent, grabbed his bow and quiver, and melted into the shadows between burning tents. A rider spotted him barely more than a young man in a thin cloak and grinned with cruel delight. Spurring his horse, he charged forward. But the unarmed youth didn't flee. Instead, Charles raised his hand. His lips moved, murmuring in a strange, inhuman cadence. "What the rider muttered. Then his horse screamed, reared, and refused to move another inch. Its eyes rolled white, nostrils flaring as it backed away from Charles as though from something unnatural. Before the rider could recover, he saw something that froze the blood in his veins. A corpse nearby, a soldier freshly slain, twitched. Then, with a sickening crack, its ribcage split open. A pale skeleton clawed its way free, the dead man's face still hanging from the bone like torn parchment. In the firelight, it turned toward the knight and grinned. "Be black sorcery," the man gasped. He yanked on the reins, desperate to flee, but his terrified horse stumbled and fell. The man went down hard, his armor clanging against the dirt. He never got up again. The undead servant lunged, and the surrounding soldiers, emboldened by the horror, fell upon the dismounted Lannister. His scream ended in a wet crunch. By the time they looked around, Charles was gone. The camp was a war zone. Even with his necromantic tricks, he wasn't arrogant enough to think he'd survive the melee for long. The skeletons could terrify and distract, but stray blades didn't discriminate between friend or foe. He needed cover. Slipping between collapsing tents, Charles ducked behind a burning pavilion, using a large water barrel as makeshift concealment. From that fiery shadow, he drew his bow. "Your arrow wounds an enemy soldier. Archery skill +1. Your arrow wounds an enemy soldier. Archery skill +1. You have slain an enemy soldier. Archery skill +10. You gain minor proficiency with the flail." Each shot felt smoother, more precise. A few enemies caught sight of him, but most turned pale at the sight of his skeletal minions glaring from the firelight and fled in panic. The few that dared charge forward never made it within striking distance, cut down by arrows or bone claws alike. It helped that horses loathed his magic. Charles had learned through practice that his chants those eerie syllables that dripped like poison unnerved beasts even more than men. Every Lannister mount that came near balked and reared, throwing its rider before ever reaching him. Gradually, a small patch of silence formed around him amid the chaos and no man's land of flickering fire and corpses. But silence attracts attention too. Not wanting to draw the eye of braver enemies, Charles slipped away again, moving cautiously along the edge of the burning camp. Everywhere around him was chaos, screams, steel, the thunder of hooves. His heart hammered in his chest. It was his first true battle, and he could feel panic clawing at his ribs. He remembered Eddard's words. "Once war begins, I can't even promise my own life." Now he understood. War was not glory or honor, it was terror and confusion, sudden and merciless. He gritted his teeth, forcing himself to focus. Then, "Help! Somebody, please help me!" The voice was faint, barely audible over the din. But his sharpened senses caught it. Turning toward the sound, he saw her, a girl running desperately through the firelight, pursued by two Lannister riders. It looked like the start of an ugly scene. Charles scanned the area. No other enemies nearby. Good. He drew an arrow, aimed, and released. The first knight dropped instantly, the arrow buried in his throat. His partner reined in sharply, startled just in time to take a second arrow through the leg. He fell from his horse, howling. A third arrow silenced him. Charles exhaled slowly. His aim had grown sharper, steadier. At this range, the shots landed like lightning. The girl stumbled toward him, eyes wide with tears, face streaked with soot. She looked pitiful and oddly familiar. Then he remembered. A Frey girl, one of the few who escaped the twins. She was the only one among that rat-faced family with any beauty to speak of, a rare rose among weeds. He'd joked once that she was proof the gods have a sense of irony. Now was hardly the time for that thought. Find somewhere safe to hide, he barked, knocking another arrow. The girl froze, trembling. I don't know where. Fifth row to the north, third tent on the right, he said quickly. Go. That's thank you. She ran. Charles watched her vanish into the shadows, then turned his attention back to the battlefield. The tent he'd sent her to belonged to the Red Priestess. He didn't know what Melisandre was truly capable of, but he was willing to bet she could handle herself better than most. If not well, he'd already done his good deed for the night. He had no intention of playing hero. There were still arrows to fire, corpses to raise and a battle to survive. Cautiously weaving through the burning camp, Charles moved like a shadow. Strike, relocate, strike again. Every shot was followed by a new burst of glowing text flickering before his eyes. You gained life energy. You acquired proficiency with flail, longsword, chain mace, horsemanship, archery. A cool sensation spread through his body, clearing his fatigue, while fragments of new knowledge settled into his mind: combat patterns, balance adjustments, even weapon handling tricks he'd never studied before. In a perverse way, this blood-soaked battlefield had become his training ground. A place of horror, but also opportunity. This was why he'd ignored Eddard Stark's warnings. Why he'd refused to retreat north. He'd come to grow stronger, and nothing spurred growth faster than a brush with death. Unfortunately, he hadn't prepared the necessary soul-collecting runes for true harvest. All he could do was rely on his battlefield-leveling ability to absorb energy from those he slew. Yet even as he improved, he could feel the limits. His body brimmed with potential, but his actual combat power didn't rise as fast as he hoped. He simply knew more things, more techniques, more motions, but raw knowledge only carried one so far. Once the surrounding enemy's strength plateaued, his learning stalled too. At least, he mused, these attackers were trained soldiers and not mere peasant conscripts. If they'd been ordinary militia, his progress would have been half as effective. Hiding behind wreckage and using the occasional skeletal minion as distraction, Charles survived. His energy reserves grew steadily, his movements sharper, his stamina never faltering. But he knew it couldn't last. At this rate, he'd soon have no choice but to retreat. Then, as his seventh quiver emptied when the smoke stung his lungs and his arms ached from drawing the bow, he heard it. The distant, thunderous rhythm of hooves. Another cavalry charge, but this one was different. He turned toward the noise, and for the first time that night, his expression changed from grim focus to raw relief. A great banner rose above the hill, silhouetted by firelight and moonlight alike, a grey dire wolf, snapping against the wind. The Stark sigil. For the first time in his life, Charles thought he'd never seen anything so beautiful. Shouts erupted across the camp as survivors spotted it too. The Lord's banner. Reinforcements. Reinforcements are here. We're saved. The desperate men of the north found new strength in their lungs. Exhausted soldiers straightened, roaring, their morale surging like wildfire. The Lannister raiders, by contrast, broke into panic. Realizing the tables were about to turn, they scrambled to flee only to be chased down by those they'd been butchering moments before. But mounted enemies were hard to stop, and most of the attackers galloped off before the full counterattack could begin. The arriving Stark cavalry didn't even pause at the camp's edge, they charged straight past, pursuing the retreating red and gold host into the darkness. Soon, the battlefield quieted. Smoke hung low, fires crackled, and the survivors began regrouping. The stench of blood and scorched flesh filled the air. A commander, one of the Stark bannermen, strode through the wreckage, barking orders as his men began pulling the wounded from the ashes. His brow furrowed as his gaze swept the camp, then froze. There, stepping out from behind a charred tent, was Charles, bow in hand, eyes hollow with exhaustion. And beside him, illuminated by the dying firelight, stood a white skeleton sentinel, motionless as a gravestone. The man's expression shifted from relief to unease in an instant. Charles noticed, but his thoughts were elsewhere. A frown creased his own face, not from being seen, but from something inside him. The energy he'd gathered, the countless motes of life he'd taken from his enemies, was no longer still. It surged through him wildly now, coursing through his veins like molten silver, spiraling faster and faster. His vision blurred. His heart pounded. It felt as if something within him was on the verge of breaking or awakening. And for the first time since the battle began, Charles felt not fear, but anticipation. Something inside him was changing. Chapter 42, Chapter 42, Lady Mormont. Chapter 42, Lady Mormont. It happened around the fourth bell of dusk, the ragged soldier stammered, voice hoarse from smoke and fear. The flickering brazier cast long shadows across his blood-streaked face as he spoke to the gathered northern lords, with Robb Stark at their head. The enemy came fast, too fast. We didn't even hear their horses until they were nearly upon the camp. There was no time to form ranks, no time to defend. I saw Sir Dustin surrounded and cut down. They knew exactly where to strike. This was planned. Robb's jaw tightened. And the sentries? Where were they? No alarms were raised, my lord. None. How does an entire cavalry charge get that close without notice? Their horses' hooves were wrapped in cloth. They moved near silent until it was too late. No one organized a defense. Commanders tried, but most were killed in the first charge or fled to rally the men. The soldier's voice trembled, and a long silence filled the tent. The gathered lords looked grim, faces etched with exhaustion and anger. "The imp's bolder than I thought," muttered one, slamming a gauntlet fist against his knee. "Marching out at night with so few men, he's either mad or desperate." "Mad or not, he succeeded," another growled. "We underestimated him." "The Crossroads army can't stay idle any longer," said Lord Sirwin, frowning. "We need to fall back to the Bay of Crabs and guard the northern crossings. Otherwise, we'll face more raids like this. If we abandon this post, our rear will be unguarded. What if the imp strikes again while we're rebuilding the bridges? Then we march from the bay and crush him head on." "Ha! Easier said than done. Do you know what kind of men fill his ranks? Half are wildling sellswords. By the time we form up, they'll already have vanished into the hills." The debate devolved into frustration and muttered curses. "Has Lord Arryn returned from the Vale?" someone asked, attempting to shift the topic. "Who knows? That harpy of a woman's probably still clinging to him. 7 damn that Lisa Arryn. If only Sir Cranston's skeleton warriors were greater in number," one of the lords remarked suddenly. "The battle would have gone far smoother." "Bah," said Sir Helman Tallheart with disdain. "Dark magic is not the way of the righteous." A snort followed from across the tent. "Righteous? Tell me, Helman, since when did you start praying to the 7 instead of counting your coin? If dark magic keeps our men alive, I say let the gods look away." "Indeed," another chimed in mockingly. "Wasn't it you, Sir Tallheart, who called the Targaryens dragons divine gifts just last winter?" "Ha! The most pious of men until faith gets in the way of victory." Laughter rippled through the tent, until one voice cut sharper than the rest. The pious King Baelor's wife bedded his brother and bore him a bastard. If holiness leads to that, perhaps Sir Tallheart aspires to sainthood. The tent erupted in muffled chuckles. Even the usually reserved lords smirked behind their hands. Tallheart's face turned crimson, but he quickly understood the shift. His outburst had offended the wrong people. A fellow bannerman leaned close and whispered, "Careful. The Lord's son is here, and that sorcery you mocked just saved his father's life." Tallheart swallowed hard, realizing his mistake. The tent fell back into uneasy silence. "Regardless," said one of the senior lords at last, "we need to find this Cranston fellow. If he has any methods to counter these raids, we could use them. Has anyone sent for him?" "The page boy says he's nowhere to be found." "I saw him after the attack but not since," said another. "And what of Lady Maege Mormont? She should be here as well. It's one thing for a wizard to skip council, but a sworn vassal refusing to attend a war meeting." "You should save that question for her daughter's funeral," someone muttered coldly. "That's right," another said sharply. "Show some damned sympathy. If your own son lay dying, would you care about strategy?" The tent grew quiet again. Outside, the ruins of the camp were slowly being rebuilt. Smoke still drifted from the burned tents, rising to the pale moon like ghosts ascending to the gods. Soldiers carried bodies to pyres or shallow graves, their faces hard with numb exhaustion. Under normal circumstances, Charles might have been curious enough to linger. But now, he had no such luxury. He stood at a nearby stream, frowning at the pile of pale fragments drifting downstream. What the hell is this molting? His whole body still tingled, a phantom itch crawling just beneath the skin. He could remember the agony vividly, his flesh tearing and peeling in layers, replaced by something unnervingly smooth. It had hurt like hell, yet there was a strange euphoria in it too. After the reinforcements arrived, Charles had slipped away from camp and gone down to the creek to wash. Ordinarily, he wouldn't be insane enough to bathe in the dead of night, especially not after surviving a battle. But what was happening to him wasn't ordinary. The life energy he'd absorbed during the fight had built up inside him, until his body began to change. He didn't know how or why, but he felt it clearly, something within him had shed its skin. His entire body had gone numb, itchy, and then under his own desperate scratching his skin began to slough off in ragged flakes, until he'd shed an entire layer. Thank the gods no one had seen it. The sight alone would have sparked panic. Now, under the moonlight, his new skin gleamed unnaturally pale and smooth. He looked almost ethereal, soft, luminous, beautiful. If anyone saw him now, they might mistake him for a woman. He grimaced. Great! I went through all that pain just for better skin. Adjusting his torn shirt, he studied his reflection in the water. He didn't feel stronger, faster, or filled with new power. The energy had burned itself out as suddenly as it had come. Guess it won't happen again, at least not until I kill someone else. He sighed, resigned. There were no answers to be found in this world or any other. Maybe I evolved, he muttered, half joking. As he walked back toward camp, he noticed his tent had been reduced to ashes. Wonderful! All the notes and magical inscriptions he'd painstakingly compiled gone. He rubbed his temples and groaned. Perfect! Back to square one. Just as he was about to head for the quartermaster to request new supplies, a shout came from across the camp. Sir Cranston! Charles turned sharply toward the voice, eyes narrowing in wary curiosity. Before him stood a short, broad-shouldered woman clad in battered armor, her grey hair a wild tangle beneath a dented helm. Though her stature barely reached his chest, her presence filled the space like a storm cloud. And yes, she was a woman, not one of the camp followers or healers, but a noble in her own right. That alone made her stand out. Female commanders were rare enough in the north to count on one hand, so Charles recognized her almost instantly. Lady Mormont, he greeted, inclining his head politely. An honor. He expected a brief exchange, perhaps a word of courtesy before she moved along, but to his surprise, the lady strode directly toward him, boots crunching against the gravel, her expression taut with urgency. "I've been waiting for you, Sir Cranston," she said. If those words had come from a young girl, Charles might have misunderstood the tone. But Madge Mormont was no blushing maiden. She was a mother of 5, a seasoned commander, and a sworn vassal of House Stark. Whatever brought her here, it wasn't idle sentiment. He straightened, wary. "You were looking for me. If you can save my daughter," she said hoarsely, "House Mormont will owe you a debt it can never repay." Her voice was cracked from sleepless nights and grief, harsh, desperate, but burning with hope. Charles blinked, taken aback by her bluntness. "I beg your pardon, Lady Mormont, but I don't understand your daughter." "She was struck down by one of the Lannister bastards," Madge interrupted, her tone suddenly sharp. "An axe cleaved through her shoulder, nearly tore her arm clean off." Charles frowned. "Then you should have your maester tend to her wounds immediately." "Maesters can't heal this," she rasped, shaking her head. "They've tried everything, her flesh is rotting, and she's slipping away by the hour. The others are already preparing for her funeral." A bitter laugh escaped her lips. "Some loyalty, isn't it?" Charles fell silent for a moment. Then, softly, "I'm sorry, my lady. But I'm no miracle worker." Her shoulders sagged. The faint gleam of hope in her eyes dimmed like a dying ember. "So the old gods truly have abandoned House Mormont," she murmured, voice thick with despair. Charles knew her story well enough. The Mormonts of Bear Island were few in number. Her elder brother had joined the Night's Watch at 70 to make room for his only son, the same son who later disgraced their house by selling slaves, forcing him into exile after Eddard Stark discovered his crimes. When her brother left, the title of Lady of Bear Island fell to Madge. She had no sons of her own, only 5 daughters, 5 fierce, stubborn girls in a land that respected swords more than sense. For years, she'd carried the burden of her house alone, hunting, training, ruling, and raising her eldest daughter, Daisy, to inherit the island's future. And now, that future lay dying on a blood-soaked cot. Her voice trembled, but her words held steel. "We've endured hunger, war, and exile, but not this. Not the end of our line." In her tent, Daisy Mormont still muttered deliriously, whispering her family's words through cracked lips. "Here we stand. If she fell, Bear Island would fall with her." Grief, rage, and helplessness warred in Madge's eyes as Charles turned to leave. He'd already shaken his head, his answer clear. But before he could take 3 steps, her voice cut through the night again. "If you can save her," she said, breath trembling, "House Mormont will serve you. In life and in death we are yours to command." Charles froze. For a long moment, the only sound was the wind, whispering through the ashes of the ruined camp. Then, slowly, he turned back to face her. Chapter 43, Chapter 43 The Healing Spell. Chapter 43 The Healing Spell. Inside the dimly lit tent, the torchlight flickered across the pale, feverish face of the woman lying on the cot. Her once healthy complexion had turned ashen white. Strands of chestnut hair clung damply to her forehead, soaked with sweat from a relentless fever. Her lips trembled, opening and closing as she murmured incoherently fragments of words lost between pain and delirium. A young noblewoman, gravely wounded, likely between the ages of 19 and 24. Her physique suggests extensive combat training. Charles stood silently at the bedside, his gaze steady. The bedclothes had been pulled aside, revealing the woman's bare upper torso, a scene that might have seemed intimate under different circumstances. But now, with the sharp scent of blood thick in the air and death hovering close, even the most lustful of men would have felt nothing but dread. A vicious crimson wound stretched diagonally from her right shoulder across her chest, nearly cleaving her in 2. The strike had been delivered with brutal precision, the weapon's edge slicing deep into flesh and bone. The camp's healers had done what they could, stitched the wound closed and packed it with herbs, but fresh blood still seeped slowly through the bandages, staining the linen red and pooling beneath her body. The metallic tang of blood filled the tent. By the bedside stood a small, broad-shouldered woman, her face lined by age and fatigue. Maej Mormont's eyes flickered with fear as she looked down at her eldest daughter, then quickly away, forcing herself to meet Charles's gaze instead. "I can't promise I can save her," Charles said finally, frowning. "But I can try. On one condition." "What condition?" Her voice was hoarse, almost breaking. "She has to survive until tomorrow afternoon." Maej hesitated, uncertainty clouding her expression. But after a moment, she clenched her jaw and nodded fiercely. "She will." "Let's hope so," he murmured, casting one last glance at the unconscious woman Daisy Mormont before turning to leave the tent. Maej followed him outside. The night wind carried the faint scent of smoke and salt from the distant sea. "To save her," Charles said, his tone calm but oddly heavy, "there must be a price." "What kind of price?" "To give life to one who's dying." He paused, his eyes gleaming faintly under the torchlight. "Another must die in her place." Maej stiffened. The soft murmur of the camp faded around her. Even spoken quietly, his words sounded like an invocation, cold, unholy, and absolute. "I'll take her place," she said without hesitation. "If my death will bring her back, so be it." "That won't be necessary," Charles replied, and despite himself, he felt a flicker of respect for the woman's resolve. "You just need to find someone healthy." "Anyone will do." "An enemy?" she asked quickly. "Preferably," he said with a nod. "But make it a woman. I doubt you'd want your daughter waking up with unexpected side effects." "Side effects?" Maej frowned at the unfamiliar term. To her, it sounded like one of those strange words the foreign mages used, probably something unpleasant. But she didn't ask. Instead, she said curtly, "There's a wildling tribe in the Moon Mountains. They raid the coast sometimes. I'll have my men capture one." "Wait," Charles said as she turned to leave, his brows rising. "There are other things I'll need prepared first." "Will it take long?" "No. But it must be precise." "I'll have my attendants await your orders," she said briskly. "Time is short, I'll lead the capture myself." Charles sighed. "Very well. But for safety's sake, bring a maester here as well. If my spell doesn't work." Maej turned back to him, her voice rough but resolute. "Even if it fails, House Mormont will remain grateful to you, Sir Cranston." "That, I swear." Charles said nothing. Her tone left no room for doubt. She had already accepted whatever cost this act demanded. Finally, he spoke again, quieter this time. "Then understand this, my lady, I have no intention of taking advantage of your despair. If I fail to save Lady Daisy, I will regret it deeply. But if I succeed—" He let the words hang, unfinished, heavy with implication. The torchlight flickered between them, casting their faces half in gold and half in shadow, one lined by grief, the other by secrets too dark to name. "House Mormont will always serve the Starks of the North," Lady Maej rasped, her voice raw from sleepless nights. "But if Daisy lives, if you truly save her, then hear me well, Sir Cranston, your enemies will be the enemies of the entire Bear Island." She held his gaze for a heartbeat longer, then turned sharply on her heel and strode off into the night. Charles stood there, watching the stocky, armor-clad figure disappear into the shadows, silent for a long time. For such a small woman, she carried herself like a giant. Her words struck with the weight of an oath carved in stone. "She's got the heart of a soldier, not a lady," he muttered to himself, almost smiling. "Feels like talking to a firefighter who's about to run into a burning building." Still, he didn't regret his decision. With House Stark's favor, he might already have a measure of protection in the north, but winning the trust of its other lords was worth more than any royal decree. And besides, it was time. He had delayed long enough. Time to master that spell. Back inside his tent, Charles took out a quill and began scribbling a detailed list: materials, herbs, binding chalk, a bronze knife, and other ritual components. He handed the parchment to a servant sent by Lady Maege. "Get everything on this list," he instructed. "Exactly as written." Then he opened the battered leather notebook he always carried and began studying. Line after line of cramped, ancient text filled the pages, written in sigils and runes that seemed to shift faintly in the flickering lamplight. He read and reread, tracing symbols in the air, copying notes onto fresh parchment, whispering fragments of incantations under his breath. The work continued through the entire night. When morning came, he ate only a crust of bread, then resumed immediately. His body felt unnaturally awake. Ever since that strange shedding the night his skin peeled away like the husk of a serpent, something inside him had changed. His stamina was endless, his focus razor sharp. He hadn't slept in nearly 30 hours, yet his mind remained crystal clear. He didn't know what it meant, but whatever it was, it seemed to be in his favor. No one disturbed him. After the devastating night raid, the entire camp was in disarray: leaders meeting, soldiers rebuilding, scouts reporting losses. By dusk, as the last golden light faded over the northern hills, Charles finally set his quill down. Not from exhaustion, simply because it was time. The moment the feather pen left his fingers, he felt the familiar lurch in his stomach, a weightless pull that twisted the air around him. The tent dissolved like smoke. And then he was gone. Meanwhile, in another tent not far away, a crimson flame flickered once, then went out, snuffed by an unseen hand. "Impossible to see," murmured a woman in scarlet robes. Her eyes reflected the last glimmer of the dying fire. Blood for blood. That was the name of the spell. It wasn't an easy one. In fact, it was among the most dangerous of the restoration arts recorded in his grimoire, something he had meant to study last, not first. But the situation left him no choice. Unlike other spells, this one required elaborate preparation, a sacrificial platform, ritual objects, sigils drawn in specific geometric patterns. It wasn't just a spell, it was a ceremony. A rite of transference. Charles found it oddly fascinating. He'd never dabbled in ritual magic before, but blood for blood seemed simple enough in principle. No prayers to dark gods, no forbidden offerings, just the pure exchange of life force from one body to another. The logic was almost mathematical. Life, converted into life. Simple. Elegant. Terrifying. He'd memorized every sigil, every line of script. The notebook's complex diagrams now lived clearly in his mind, each one etched with uncanny precision, one of the stranger gifts that had come with his awakening as a necromancer. Now all he lacked was practice. He would use the gateway, the time difference between worlds, to master it safely. When he returned, he would be ready to save Daisy Mormont's life. This training would take time. A lot of it. So, does this count as seclusion training? In the other world, the quiet, modern streets of Privet, Charles reclined in a bathtub, half submerged in warm water, letting the tension drain from his muscles. He had told the church's monks he was working on creative writing. That little white lie had bought him the privacy he needed to vanish for days on end without suspicion. But sometimes he wondered what would happen if one of them got curious enough to check. "Am I actually going to have to write a book?" he muttered, groaning. The thought alone was exhausting. He could memorize spells and rituals effortlessly, but writing, that was a different kind of sorcery altogether. His memories of his previous life were fragmented at best, he couldn't even recall a single book well enough to plagiarize. Besides, he said aloud, who the hell memorizes every book word for word? I'm a mage, not an AI. The sarcasm made him chuckle. If push came to shove, he could always borrow a book from Westeros, copy it out, and present it as his own. People in this world adored old literature. No one would notice the anachronism. After all, who could stop a modern soul from writing a classic in the Middle Ages? With a sigh, he sank a little deeper into the bath water, mind flickering between worlds, spells, and schemes. Two realities. One path. And tomorrow night he would test the spell that could steal death itself. Chapter 44, Chapter 44 The Inheritance Right. Chapter 44 The Inheritance Right. For more than 10 straight days, Charles barely stepped outside his door. He spent every waking hour practicing blood for blood, the spell that demanded both focus and nerve. Other than eating, drinking, and the bare minimum of human necessities, he didn't leave the house once. A true shut-in. Not even during the internet age was I this reclusive, he muttered to himself one morning, rubbing his eyes. Guess I had to cross into another world just to become a professional hermit. It was half a joke, but there was truth in it. He had no plans to change. Perhaps it was because he desperately wanted to master the spell as soon as possible. Or perhaps, deep down, it was because this unfamiliar world, its politics, its faith, its blood-soaked lands gave him no real sense of safety. Logically, a young spellcaster like him should be out mingling, learning from others of the craft. But experience had taught him otherwise. 2 encounters with fellow mages were enough to understand that, until one's strength was proven, it was wiser to stay invisible. Strong men did not befriend the weak, they used them. Of course, wealth could buy exceptions, but Charles had none to spend. The world of A Song of Ice and Fire, he'd come to realize, was still a realm ruled by mortal ambition, not true sorcery. Dragons and prophecies aside, most magic here was politics in disguise. Gold and names mattered more than spells. Dragon glass was valuable, yes, but rare, and for now, utterly out of reach. He'd already asked the Red Woman to send a letter to Dragonstone for him. Her influence there was considerable, backed by a few hidden allies. He figured, if she's going to tag along with me, I might as well get something out of it. Unfortunately, the 7 kingdoms weren't exactly known for swift correspondence. Unless Stannis himself sent envoys north to meet with Eddard Stark, there was little chance he'd see any results soon. And so, Charles buried himself in work. Day and night blurred together. He ate little, slept less, and lost himself in the endless cycles of repetition, writing, reciting, redrawing runes until the motions became automatic. Crumpled sheets of failed inscriptions piled around his feet like snowdrifts. When the floor grew too cluttered, he tossed them into the fireplace and watched them burn to ash. He was consumed. The prompts from the Eye of Insight now danced before his eyes even in his dreams. Sometimes he woke up in confusion, unable to tell whether he had dreamt of practicing, or practiced while dreaming. It was madness, yes, but productive madness. And then, just when he thought he was nearing mastery, a message arrived that snapped him back to reality. Sir Seth, chairman of the Noble Welfare and Administration Association, had returned to Pita City. The title of Baron entitles you to an annual royal subsidy of 50 gold crowns, said the portly man sitting across from him, voice smooth and measured. He wore an immaculate waistcoat stretched tight over his belly, his gloved fingers delicately holding a porcelain coffee cup. That tradition has stood for nearly a century, the man continued, speaking in the polished royal accent of Doolan. However, your timing is rather unfortunate. The latest council session has just approved a revision. Charles raised an eyebrow. A revision? Indeed. The man smiled pleasantly, as if discussing the weather. Prince Braun proposed that the annual stipend be divided into monthly payments. Apparently, too many of our newly ennobled gentlemen have proven financially irresponsible. He took a slow sip of coffee before adding smoothly. Of course, I have no doubt you are not one of those men, Sir Cranston. But rules are rules, and the Crown's decisions are not ours to refuse. Charles listened in silence for a few seconds, then asked the only thing that really mattered to him. So, Where's the ceremony? They were sitting in what looked more like a government reception hall than any place of noble heritage. No banners, no heralds, no guests in finery, just a desk, a chandelier, and this well-fed bureaucrat with the patience of a snail. It felt less like an inheritance ritual and more like renewing a driver's license. Wasn't there supposed to be a ritual? Trumpets? Witnesses? A priest waving incense or something? If this was what passed for nobility in the modern kingdom of Dulin, he couldn't help but feel just a little cheated. Charles wasn't actually interested in the so-called ceremony. He was just confused. Ceremony, repeated Chairman Seth with a grin that made his cheeks fold into neat little ridges. Ah, if you've got plenty of friends here in Pita City, you're welcome to host a banquet tonight to celebrate. Of course, he raised a pudgy finger, it'll be entirely at your own expense. The association doesn't do reimbursements. He chuckled, clearly amused by his own joke. Alternatively, he continued smoothly, you could send out invitations to the other noble families in the city if, that is, you're interested in making connections. Charles blinked. So, that's it? I'm done. He glanced down at the stack of documents he'd just signed, his inheritance contract, the seal still drying in red wax and the small medallion resting on top of it, the emblem of his newly acquired barony. It all felt oddly anticlimactic. Different times, different customs, sighed the portly chairman, swirling his coffee with a silver spoon. No land, no tax income. Our nobles today are far poorer than our ancestors. And as for holding a grand inheritance ceremony, well, you'd have to invite half the city's upper circle. He leaned forward conspiratorially. Let me be blunt, Sir Cranston. These people have expensive tastes and egos to match. If your banquet isn't grand enough, they'll gossip for weeks about how small-time the new baron is. It's a waste of gold and goodwill. Why bother? We're not idiots. He smiled. So, generally speaking, act within one's means. Charles finished for him. Exactly. The chairman raised his cup and took a satisfied sip. Then, as if the matter were settled, he continued in that same smooth bureaucratic tone. As for your assets in Kenyon Town, I'll have a detailed report delivered to your residence in the next few days. I must apologize, I wasn't expecting your visit quite so soon. He dabbed his lips with a handkerchief and added, now, aside from your monthly royal subsidy, His Majesty's government has instructed all city administrations to grant nobles priority consideration for municipal positions. In other words, if you'd like, we can help you secure a post in local governance. Please don't take this personally, I say the same thing to every nobleman who comes through that door. It's policy. He smiled meaningfully. The salary's decent, too, if you're interested. Not for now, thank you, Charles replied flatly. Work? He almost laughed. He hadn't crossed worlds and studied forbidden magic just to clock in and out like some office clerk. That would be humiliating. And besides, he wasn't broke. Well, not yet. Seeing there was nothing else to discuss, Charles rose from his seat, pocketed the certificate, and prepared to leave. But before he reached the door, Seth called out again. A plump, ring-laden hand extended toward him, accompanied by an oily smile. Pleasure doing business with you, Sir Cranston. Allow me to reintroduce myself, Peter Seth, Baron of Watchtower Town. Charles shook his hand, forcing a polite smile. Later, in the carriage back home. Privilege breeds arrogance, he mused quietly, turning the 5 gleaming gold coins over in his hand. That was his first monthly stipend, his noble welfare. For a commoner, that amount would have supported an entire family for months. But for him, it was just a casual allowance, no effort, no labor. Some people break their backs just to survive, he murmured, while others lie in bed and collect gold for breathing. He sighed and pocketed the coins. There was no point pretending to be righteous about it. He was on the winning side of that equation now. Best not to complain. Still, the irony wasn't lost on him. For all the talk of nobility and titles, the only thing that truly mattered in this world or any world was power. Not gold. Not status. Power. And that was something he could earn with his own two hands. Dash. As the carriage rolled onto Privet Street, the familiar houses came into view. He stepped down, stretched his arms, and was just about to unlock his front door, when a knock came from behind. A messenger, breathless and pale, handed him a sealed envelope marked with the crimson sigil of the church. "Sir Cranston," the man said, bowing low. "Your mission from the church has arrived." Charles stared at the seal for a moment, feeling a strange mix of curiosity and dread. So soon? He exhaled slowly, tucked the envelope into his coat, and stepped back into the night. The next chapter of his story had already begun. Chapter 45, Chapter 45 A Simple Assignment. Chapter 45 A Simple Assignment. 2 days ago there was a murder in a small town north of Pita City called Vensay. The scene shows signs of ritual sacrificial marks. Our preliminary assessment points to a demon apostle. I plan to give this case to you. Back at the church, Charles met Brother Worshie and got straight to the point without small talk. "Any concrete intelligence?" he asked. "None," Worshie answered. "You'll need to question the local constabulary when you arrive. Whether you serve as an official witch hunter or an external operative, you must learn to act independently. The church will only provide logistics support." Charles nodded. He had expected as much. Worshie smiled kindly at his calmness, then rose and pulled a blue-bound notebook from a shelf. He handed it to Charles. "This is a field journal I kept years ago," he said. "It records traits, behaviors, and countermeasures for demon apostles. Read it when you have time. Be cautious," he added. "Some cults anticipate the church's movements and set traps. Think carefully and observe a lot on this mission. You're going out for the first time, don't be rash. Work with local law enforcement where possible. Don't assume that learning a few spells makes you better at investigation than those whose trade it is. Except for very special magics, finding people is their business, not yours." He continued lecturing patiently. Charles kept nodding along. Finally the middle-aged priest grew serious again. "Do not show these demon apostles mercy," Worshie said. "They do not deserve it. Let one go and you will live to regret it." "What did he do?" Charles asked when he heard this, curiosity cutting through the formal warnings. "He killed his wife and 2 children, the monk said, voice steady but with a cold edge. Then he gouged out their hearts and cooked them." Charles fell silent. Cruelty is a virtue, and the best way to please a demon, the thought slipped through his mind, one of those lines you read in the wrong book and never forget. After saying his goodbyes to Worshie, Charles did not linger. He hired a carriage while the day was still young and left at once. Vensay lay north of Pita City and was only a half-day's ride from Charles's own hold, Kenyon Town. He spent the first night in Kenyon, and by noon the next day his carriage rolled into Vensay. He had expected a messy, time-consuming assignment, the kind of thing that would let him show off and do something grand. Instead, when he found the official in charge, he was told the so-called demon apostle had already been captured. Captured? Charles blinked. He'd ridden all that way expecting to act, to intervene, to be the savior. Instead he looked a little deflated. "Truss got unlucky," explained the dust-streaked constable. "He ran into a trap the old hunter Madden set ages ago. By the way, Master Madden's our best tracker. He once fought a boar alone." Charles listened to the middle-aged officer talk. The idea of a fabled demon apostle being nabbed in a long-forgotten hunter's pit by a local seemed almost comical. He'd pictured grand confrontation, now it looked like he'd been reduced to an extra in a hush of practical folk business. The disappointment passed quickly. Better to avoid unnecessary trouble than to seek a showy fight. Under the leadership of Mayor Winters, they went to the town's police station. Station was generous. It was more of a wooden house on stilts at the edge of the wood, shaded by trees. Inside there were only 2 officers, bored and reading the paper. They rose politely when the mayor and his party entered. "This is the church's demon purifier, Sir Cranston," Mayor Winters introduced. "Ah, welcome, sir," the 2 policemen called in unison. They were a touch surprised by Charles's youthful appearance but otherwise pleased. "You finally came. Since Truss's arrest he's been howling and making awful noises every night, purely terrifying. If guns could kill him, we'd have blasted his head long ago." They led Charles down into the station's cell, which was really just a basement with wooden stairs. At the bottom, curled on the floor and reeking, lay a man covered in grime. Close up, the man's face was ordinary, arguably handsome, but a faint layer of blackish fuzz twined over his skin. The sight alone unclenched any romanticized notion Charles might have entertained. The bound man rolled and snarled, venom in his eyes. The moment he opened his mouth, Charles reconsidered his first impression. "I gave them life," the man screamed. "I raised them. I took them back because they are mine, everything is mine. You meddling pests, this is mine." The man writhed and spat the words like acid. His black hair seemed to thicken as his fury rose. Charles's mind drew a line to what he'd read: "Skin dusted with dark fuzz marks a low-grade apostle. These creatures often come from crude rituals or contagion barely tainted by hellfire, but tainted enough." Low tier as they were, demon apostles shared a terrible trait: undeath. Weapons could wound them, but could not truly kill them. Destroy the skull, crush the heart, so long as a rough body outline remained, true death wouldn't follow. That was why ordinary townsfolk's efforts often failed or required unusual methods. Charles understood now why the church warned him: a successful operation was rarely a neat, clean thing. Of course, if you hacked a demon apostle into minced meat or burned them to ash, their so-called immortality would no longer apply. But that introduced another problem: the infectious nature of their flesh and blood. It was a curse in every sense of the word. The evidence was clear enough that there was no possibility of wrongful judgment. Charles didn't need to interrogate or waste words. He took one final look at the man writhing on the ground, then ignored his roaring curses. Slowly, he unclasped the thorned cross hanging around his neck and gripped it firmly in his hand. Under the reverent gazes of the 2 policemen and the growing terror in the prisoner's eyes, the young man raised his right hand. The silver cross swung slightly in the dim underground light. Then, in a voice calm but heavy with command, Charles began to recite a sacred incantation. The air vibrated. A blinding cross of light bloomed above his palm. It spun, pulsed, and released waves of searing heat. The temperature in the basement surged from warm, to stifling, to an unbearable furnace. The demon screamed. "Ah!" The sound tore through the narrow chamber, raw and feral. His body twisted, contorted, his skin blistering like meat on an open flame. The shrieks grew weaker and weaker until finally, a flash. The light expanded into a cocoon of white radiance, then burst apart with a sound like shattering glass. The heat warped the air, and when it faded, all that remained was a small heap of black ash on the floor. "It's over," one of the policemen muttered, half in awe, half in disbelief. 4 days, their bullets and clubs had done nothing to the creature. Yet this young man had merely spoken a few words and reduced the unkillable to dust. In the face of such power, mortals could only stand aside and watch. Their hands were too small for the work of gods. And yet, it was a hell of a show. After they climbed back upstairs, Charles gave a brief report and was preparing to leave when one of the officers called out to him. "Wait, sir. We found something strange during Truss's arrest. You should take a look." He handed Charles a sealed letter. Charles frowned and unfolded it. The handwriting was jagged, the ink uneven, but the contents made him pause. It was a correspondence addressed to a city official in the capital, written by none other than Truss, the man who now existed only as Ash. The letter referenced the matter being handled and awaiting further instruction. No details, no background, no explanation, just the tone of a man reporting to his superior. But that was enough to reveal one thing. Someone in the capital, an officer of the crown, was in league with a demon apostle. Or worse, perhaps at the time of writing, Truss had not yet become a demon at all. Is the kingdom rotting from the inside? Charles muttered under his breath, brow furrowed. The implications were vast, too vast. If the letter was genuine, it meant corruption ran deep enough to stain the highest levels of government. But it could also be nothing more than a madman's delusion. He sighed and folded the letter. Better hand it over to the church. Whether it's true or not, this isn't something a small-time hunter like me should meddle in. And honestly, why would a capital official be corresponding with some nameless villager in the middle of nowhere? With that thought, he bid farewell to the mayor and the two grateful officers, then set off immediately. By the next morning, he was back in Pita City. You return quickly, remarked Brother Worshie as Charles stepped into the church. 2 days apart, the priest looked exactly as serene as ever. How did it go? Smoothly. Couldn't have gone smoother, Charles replied with a faint shrug. By the time I arrived, the local police had already caught the culprit. All I did was handle the purification. The priest nodded approvingly. That's often how these missions go. Mortal weapons cannot truly harm apostles, only the Lord's radiance can cleanse such evil. He turned toward the chapel's altar and bowed reverently to the statue. Charles, being notably less devout, decided this was the right time to hand over the letter. This might be important, he said. Something hidden, maybe. Hidden. Worshie took the envelope and read through it, eyes narrowing ever so slightly. But he showed no outward emotion. With a small nod, he tucked the letter into his sleeve. Then, from that same sleeve, he produced another envelope and offered it to Charles. Charles blinked. Another letter? What is this, divine correspondence hour? The priest's smile deepened. No, child. This is your path of growth. My, what? Open it at home, Worshie said, waving a hand. Consider it a surprise. But keep it secret. Show it to no one. Charles resisted the urge to roll his eyes. Right. Sure. A big mystery. He nodded politely, left the church and tore open the envelope the moment he was outside. Inside was a single sheet of parchment. A list. He scanned it, eyebrows raising higher with each line. Illumination 5 tasks. Healing 10 tasks. Banishment 20 tasks. Blessing 25 tasks. Judgment 60 tasks. Divine Grace 120 tasks. Resurrection 300 tasks. The column stretched endlessly downward, a catalogue of holy spells, each followed by a required contribution count. He let out a low whistle. 5 missions for a flashlight spell, and 300 for resurrection. Are they kidding me? He quickly did the math in his head. A calendar year in Arcavia had 10 months. 1 mission a month meant 30 years for the most expensive spell. Yeah, no, he muttered, folding the list and tucking it away. Guess I'll stick to necromancy for now. Later, as he walked home, something else caught his attention. He glanced down and summoned his status window, and to his surprise, it had changed. Name, Charles Cranston. Age, 16. Condition, vibrant and healthy. Skills mastered. Eye of insight, passive. Bone resurrection, 99/100%. Curse of agony, 30/100%. Purification, 3/100%. Touch of fatigue, 15/100%. Blood for blood, 0/100%. Portal gate recharge complete, 431.12.37.45. He closed the window, a faint smile tugging at his lips. Step by step, he murmured to himself. If I'm going to survive this world and both of them, I'd better start collecting more than just spells. Chapter 46, Chapter 46 Old Debts. Chapter 46 Old Debts. In the Gate world, half a month had passed. Yet in the world of ice and fire, not even a moment had gone by. The scene was exactly as it had been when Charles left half a month ago. To everyone else, nothing had changed. But for him, everything had. He had changed. The world simply hadn't noticed yet. As the lingering feeling of weightlessness faded, Charles lifted his gaze toward the dusky sky outside the tent. It was still twilight. The camp was alive with the noise of men at work, soldiers clearing away the wreckage and corpses from last night's disaster. Charles picked up the long sword hanging beside the tent pole. After a moment's thought, he crouched down and began to carve into the packed earth. He was preparing for the operation, the final rehearsal before attempting the real thing. He had practiced this countless times in the Gate world, but now that it mattered, he couldn't afford even the smallest mistake. The woman's condition was critical. Every second mattered. Her life was already slipping away second by second, heartbeat by heartbeat. This had to be done perfectly. Dash. As the blade moved, strange lines began to take form. Before long, 2 intricate pentagrams were etched into the ground. Each star was encircled by a wide ring, and within the blank spaces, he carefully inscribed strange symbols: crescents, squares, triangles, jagged mountain shapes, and clusters of obscure runes that defied language. There were faint skull markings, twisted like vines across the lines of the circle, signs of death woven into geometry. From each point of the first pentagram extended a dark line, winding with countless sigils like a chain of black iron. They reached toward the second pentagram, identical in shape but subtly different in pattern. From above, it looked like 5 conduits linking 2 vast, mirrored gates. And that was precisely what they were: channels between life and death. The spell Blood for Blood was far more complex than anything Charles had practiced before. It wasn't really a spell at all. It was a ritual. He had poured endless effort into mastering it. Without the aid of his eye of insight, he doubted he could have learned it at all. For an untrained apprentice to understand the ritual on his own, that would have been madness. Dash. When the design was complete, Charles examined it closely, mentally checking each line and sigil. Then, satisfied, he wiped it all away and began again. Precision mattered more than speed. He didn't know how long he worked before a servant ducked into the tent and interrupted him. "Is something wrong?" Charles asked without looking up. The servant glanced nervously at the strange markings scorched into the dirt, his voice low. "Sir Cranston. Lady Maedge has finished the preparations. She wishes to know when you will begin." Charles's tone was cool and distant, still locked in focus. "Now," he said simply. The servant instinctively lowered his gaze. There was something in Charles's eyes, a quiet, spectral intensity that unnerved even seasoned men. Charles sheathed his blade, slung it over his shoulder, and followed the servant out into the twilight. Dash. "Lady Maedge," came the deep voice of Eddard Stark, "I grieve for your daughter's suffering, but think carefully. To save one life by taking another, do you not find that cruel?" The air in Maedge Mormont's tent was heavy. Eddard's face was drawn and pale, exhaustion visible from his long, hurried ride from the Vale. He had heard of the Bear Island lady's desperate actions, and as soon as he returned to the northern camp, he came straight here without rest, without delay. "To me," Maedge replied, her voice rough but steady, "it's a small price to pay." She did not shy away from her liege lord's disapproval. Her eyes, fierce and weary, held not guilt but grim resolve. Eddard's voice grew lower, colder, the tone of a man long accustomed to command. "You should weigh this decision carefully," he warned. "This kind of act stains the soul." But Maedge no longer cared about souls. "If Daisy can live," she rasped, "I'll consider anything." And with respect, my lord, she is not one of your northern subjects. If you believe this would sully your honor, then by all means. She did not finish her sentence. But her meaning was clear. Even the old wolf fell silent for a moment. The flickering light of the brazier threw long shadows between them. One cast by grief, the other by duty. And neither would yield easily to the other. The mountain clans will never thank you for this, my lord, Lady Maedge said flatly. Eddard Stark frowned. The 7 kingdoms have long been united. Every soul in Westeros is bound under the laws of the realm. And for 1,000 years, House Mormont has kept faith with the old gods. You of all people should know the worth of life. The mountain clans have never sworn to the Baratheons, Maedge countered, her voice sharp with bitterness. As for your old gods, I have prayed to them. I prayed for my house to prosper, for Bear Island to be fed and safe. Just last night, I prayed that the gods might spare my daughter's life. But they never answered me, Lord Stark. Not once. Eddard's reply was calm but unyielding. Faith lies within the heart. To bargain for reward only shows a lack of it, Lady Maedge. Easy for you to say, she snapped. Her patience finally broke. For days she had fought fear and grief, but now it came pouring out like molten steel. She glared at the tall, grim figure standing in the tent's entrance. If it were your child lying there writhing and screaming in pain, could you still speak so coldly? What of Robb? Sansa? Arya? Bran? Rickon? Or even that pretty bastard of yours? Her voice rose, raw with fury. Oh, I forgot, in the north, no one dares oppose the great Lord Stark. You do as your honor commands, and the rest of us must live with it. Lady Maedge. Don't call me that, she cut him off, her voice cracking. You showed no such courtesy when you condemned my poor nephew. Spare me your civility now. Eddard's tone hardened. Yoram Mormont broke the laws of the realm and the code of the nobility. You know this. Honor, Maedge spat. That's what you men call it, your grand, hollow word. I'm just an old woman, Lord Stark, and I only care about my blood. Her blue eyes burned as she stared up at him. You already executed the only son our house had left. Tell me, do you mean to kill another heir of Bear Island today? The words struck like arrows, sharp, unrelenting, and cruelly precise. Outside the tent, those who had gathered to eavesdrop fell utterly silent. The air itself seemed to freeze. Eddard Stark said nothing. He stood in the doorway, his shadow cast long by the flickering torchlight. His 2 young attendants exchanged uneasy glances but dared not move or speak. Many northern lords had already gathered nearby, drawn by the shouting. None of them, however, dared intervene. Everyone knew the truth. House Mormont was on the verge of extinction. Their line had thinned to a pitiful few. The patriarch, Jeor Mormont, had taken the black in his old age, joining the Night's Watch to make room for his son. And that son Yoram Mormont had soon disgraced himself, selling poachers into slavery to pay his debts. It didn't matter that those men were criminals. Under the king's law, slavery was forbidden in all 7 kingdoms. When the Warden of the North learned of it, he acted as his duty demanded with cold, unwavering justice. Eddard Stark ordered Yora's execution. The last male of House Mormont. No heirs. No mercy. Some had called it honorable. Others had called it heartless. House Mormont never forgot that old debt, someone whispered among the lords. Another murmured. Lord Stark's honor commands respect, but sometimes, his honor cuts deeper than any sword. He's a just man, said a third, sighing. But justice without compassion can be cruel. Poor Lady Maedge, fate has dealt her nothing but loss. They spoke quietly, for none wished to draw the old wolf's attention. All assumed the outcome was decided, that Eddard Stark, the man who had executed his own bannerman's son, would never allow dark sorcery to save another life. But then something unexpected happened. The man they all thought unshakable, the Warden of the North, the embodiment of cold honor, stepped back. After a long, heavy silence, Eddard Stark turned away. He said not a word. Without explanation, he lifted the flap of the tent and left. Lady Maege stood frozen, her grief-stricken face caught between disbelief and defiance. The lords outside watched, stunned, as the old wolf of Winterfell walked away in silence. "Did I imagine that?" one man murmured, dazed. "No," another replied slowly, eyes wide. "You saw it too." And somewhere in the uneasy quiet that followed, a third voice whispered the thought on everyone's mind. What in the God's name happened to Lord Stark in King's Landing? Chapter 47, Chapter 47 Blood for Blood. Chapter 47 Blood for Blood. When Charles arrived with the servant guiding him, the air around the tent was strangely still. Under the dimming glow of dusk, only the whisper of wind and the distant shouts of soldiers training drifted through the camp. As he walked forward, he could feel countless eyes on him, curious, uneasy, and oddly complicated. He had no idea why everyone looked at him like that. But since Lady Maege waved him over, Charles chose to ignore the strange attention and simply stepped into the large tent that had been prepared well in advance. Moments after he entered, several soldiers carried in a thick, polished stone slab. Behind it came the unconscious female wildling, limp and bound, followed by bundles of various ritual components wrapped in cloth. Last of all, they carried in the wounded woman herself. Her body reeked of blood and wrought pale skin slick with sweat, the heavy scent of damp bandages mixed with herbs clinging to her like a suffocating fog. The soldiers at the entrance involuntarily wrinkled their noses, quietly grimacing at the smell. Lady Maege stepped inside after her daughter, but Charles immediately shooed her out. "I need silence." The fierce woman who had just been fearless enough to challenge her own liege lord now obediently backed out like a scolded child. Time passed. From outside, there was no sound, no chanting, no movement, not even a whisper from within the tent. The gathered lords and watching soldiers grew increasingly restless, while Lady Maege's anxiety peaked. Just when curiosity was about to boil over, the tent flap lifted. Charles poked his head out, scanning the crowd. His gaze stopped on Lord Eddard Stark, who had quietly returned and was trying not to draw attention. "You," Charles said, waving a hand. "Come help me with something." "What?" The old wolf, who had been hoping no one noticed him, stiffened as 100 eyes instantly locked onto him. His long, solemn face twitched with embarrassment. But with so much attention on him, he couldn't refuse. Without asking questions, he followed Charles into the tent. The words Charles whispered to him inside, however, made Ned Stark's face tighten with indignation. "You could have done this yourself," Ned muttered. "I can't bring myself to do it," Charles replied, perfectly calm. "And you think I can?" "Oh, come on," Charles scoffed. "I'm saving one of your people here. What more do you want from me?" "I have already accepted that this goes against my honor," Ned hissed. "And now you want me to personally?" "You already accepted it," Charles cut him off. "So what's one more step? Is this about your honor, or just your pride as Lord Stark?" Besides," Charles added coldly, "wouldn't you rather have control over the act yourself? Someone has to do it either way." That silenced Ned. In the dim lamplight, his long face shifted between anger, shame, and grim resolve. He stood frozen, torn between duty, honor, and the life hanging in the balance a few feet away. Finally, Ned Stark let out a long, complicated sigh. "At times, I truly suspect you were sent from the seventh hell to drag me into the abyss." He didn't even look at Charles after saying that. Instead, he stepped toward the stone slab where the unconscious wildling woman lay. He stared at her for several long seconds, knelt beside her, and murmured a brief prayer. Then under Charles's impatient stare Ned opened his eyes, picked up the tool placed at his feet, hesitated just for a heartbeat, and brought it down on her wrist with a brutal, decisive strike. The woman's sealed eyelids snapped open. A shriek erupted from her throat, raw, ragged, and full of primal agony. The scream ripped through the tent canvas and stabbed into every ear outside. The sound was so harrowing that even the hardened soldiers standing guard felt their faces tighten. The scream grew louder. So loud that distant groups of soldiers lifted their heads, startled, and began drifting toward the commotion. Those who had been ignoring this corner of camp finally noticed the disturbance around the tent. And then things became worse, far worse. Amid the woman's shrill wails, another sound slithered into existence. A whispering chorus, chilling, murky, inhuman. Like dead souls being dragged down into the abyss. Like unseen wraiths crowding around a doomed mortal, their laughter soft and venomous. The wildling woman's agony peaked. Inside the tent, her cries devolved into bestial roars. "Daughter of Dog Sinway will cut off your heads! You cowardly southern pigs! Cut off your heads! Cut off your heads! Stop! Sinway hurts! It hurts! Kill Sinway! Kill Sinway now! Please, please, ah!" By now, dusk had vanished entirely, and night smothered the sky. Inside the tent, wavering lamplight danced like ghosts along the canvas walls. Paired with the black sorcerer's low murmured incantations and the dying girl's desperate pleas, the place felt less like a medical tent and more like a torture chamber built at the edge of hell. Outside, soldiers who had not been present originally gathered in droves, drawn by the sound. Their expressions were overwhelmingly curious, while those who had been near the tent from the start were pale with dread. Even surrounded by so many people, the cold dread crawling up their spines was unmistakable. The atmosphere was suffocating. Some men bolted outright, unable to bear it. Others forced themselves to stand still, though their trembling legs betrayed their fear. Everything they heard and imagined was dragging them deeper. Downward into a pit of terror. Fortunately, it didn't last long. The wildling's screams weakened, fading to thin, shuddering gasps. Then after one long, rattling inhale, her voice vanished like a dying insect's final flutter. At that same moment, the eerie whispers faded into silence. Now came the waiting. For those outside, the silence was both a relief and a source of terror. They stared at the darkened tent as if expecting a demon, something monstrous and hungry, to burst out at any moment. Among the crowd, the red-robed priestess arrived, blending into the mass of soldiers. She too stared intently at the tent, her expression unreadable. Several soldiers noticed her presence but did not dare speak. Her reputation had already spread through the camp. Not because of her beauty, but because of her powers. And because she traveled with the black sorcerer. She conjured flames with a flick of her fingers, kept her robes pristine no matter the grime of camp life, and could recount the life history of a stranger as if reading from a book. Some believed she was equal in strength to Charles. Others whispered she might be stronger, certainly more mysterious. But tonight, even the most superstitious soldier had eyes only for the tent. Fear and anticipation filled every gaze. From above, the crowd looked like a swarm of ants converging on a piece of sweet meat, drawn irresistibly toward something both frightening and fascinating. And then, the tent flap lifted. Charles stepped out. "How is she?" Lady Maedge rushed forward immediately, ignoring everyone else. "She needs rest. Let her sleep. She'll be fine by morning," Charles answered while pinching his nose, then hurried off without further explanation. He didn't even glance at the crowd of stunned soldiers. "What happened in there?" murmured several voices. But before they could speculate further, Ned Stark emerged from the tent and all attention shifted to him. "My lord! Lord Stark!" Ned surveyed the gathered crowd with a troubled expression. "Get someone to clean the inside," he said quietly. "Don't let the men see it." And with that, he too hurried away. His behavior shocked his bannermen even more than Charles's hasty retreat. Charles being rattled was understandable. But Lord Eddard Stark, calm, steadfast, iron-willed Ned Stark looking shaken? That unsettled them deeply. Unable to resist their curiosity, the nearby lords pushed into the tent. A wave of stench hit them instantly, a foul reek like a corpse left to rot in a swamp. Gagging and covering their noses, they scanned the scene. What they saw made several of them blanch. At the center of the ritual circle, an intricate design of rings, symbols, and ominous runes, lay the young noblewoman, now fully healed, her skin warm and rosy, breathing evenly in peaceful sleep. And beside her, a corpse. Or what was left of one. A shriveled, brown-black husk, contorted in a posture of pure agony. Its face was twisted, its eye sockets sunken and gaping. Its limbs crooked unnaturally, as though the body had died mid-struggle, trapped in unbearable torment. Pinned into its throat, wrists, ankles, and chest were 5 corroded iron spikes, driven deep into bone, fixing the corpse flat against the ritual slab like a specimen nailed in place. Frozen forever in its final moment of horror. Chapter 48, Chapter 48, A Long Council and a Proposal. Chapter 48, A Long Council and a Proposal. The host army encamped at the crossroads was unchanged. Morning mist clung to the ground, cool droplets in the air easing if only slightly the shadow that had hung over the men's hearts since last night. The healing that happened the evening before had become an unspoken taboo. Everyone tacitly avoided mentioning it. The lords even issued orders forbidding the soldiers from discussing anything related. Violators would face severe punishment. And so another endless council began. By the gods, what is wrong with Lady Lisa of the Eyrie? That's her own sister. She'd really rather let her die. It's not just that. She refused us passage through the Vale, even by sea. Is she sure she hasn't already crawled into old Tywin's pocket? Family means nothing when compared to one's own cowardly little life. A lord snorted. Those Vale Knights follow a woman with no equipment, and now they've grown into a bunch of eunuchs themselves. Jonaran is murdered, and they won't even avenge him. After this, how do they dare talk about honor? Since the Vale won't help, who can we count on? Anyone with half a brain can see the Riverlands are already a damned mess. What about contacting Renly Baratheon? Renly? He's praying we and the Lannisters kill each other. He won't lift a finger for us. And since Lord Eddard pledged himself to Renly's older brother Stannis, Renly now sees us as enemies. How about negotiating? The moment that word dropped, an old white-bearded lord who'd been quietly sitting in a corner exploded. Negotiate? My liege lord's wife and the Tullus are practically hostages in Tywin's claws. What do you think he will demand? And my 2 sons died in the Whispering Wood, another was taken captive, I don't even know if he's alive. The Lannisters nearly wiped out my entire line. How can I make peace? How? His roar ignited chaos inside the tent. No one came out of this war unscathed, Lord Karstark. We mourn your sons, truly, but you must consider the bigger picture. Jaime Lannister is locked in Riverrun. If you want vengeance, you'd have to break the Lannister blockade. Do you have a plan? In the end, we still have to break Tywin's damned river blockade. How? We've tried. To enter the Riverlands, we must build a bridge. Slow, yes, but at least possible. To build a bridge, we need a large force guarding it. And what then? Those Lannister raiders can strike at any moment, and we must split our troops to deal with that damned imp sneaking around. 7 hells! Why didn't that old goat Valder Frey just poison himself and spare us the trouble? We have no cities. No strongholds. We're sitting ducks out here. If the Vale let us through, none of this would be happening. 7 hells, damn Lady Lisa! Silence fell for a moment, until someone quietly asked. So, where is His Majesty? The question hung heavily in the air. Setting aside Lord Karstark's grievances, we marched to rescue Lord Eddard, and that has been accomplished. The army remains here for his sake, not ours. So where is King Stannis? Everyone turned to Ned. Ned Stark paused, then replied. His Grace will send envoys soon. They will bring his strategy. His voice was low, matching the grim set of his long face. Ever since returning from the Vale, he had carried a heavy gloom. Last night's events and whatever he witnessed only deepened it. Someone muttered under his breath. Dragonstone is nothing but a barren rock. Few men, fewer ships. What plans could Stannis possibly have? But he didn't dare say it loudly. Ned Stark's authority in the north was absolute. If he had pledged to Stannis, his bannermen had to follow. Whether they liked it or not. More proposals came. All were discussed. All were rejected. No help from the Vale. No help from Stannis, at least not yet. As for the Ironborn, Theon Greyjoy had returned home long ago and sent no word. And even if he had, the Iron Islands were too far to matter right now. The arguments grew louder. Fists slammed tables. Chairs scraped. Men stormed out only to return moments later, cooler but still frustrated. Tywin Lannister's river blockade, the Ironford Lock, was strangling them. Behind Riverrun stood the impassable stronghold of Harrenhal. Every time the North tried constructing a bridge, Lannister riders swept in to destroy the work. 3 choices remained: build, assault, or retreat. Retreat was impossible. Building took too long and demanded constant defense. Storming the city? They had tried. The losses would be catastrophic and Tywin would be delighted. So progress remained stalled. During pauses in the shouting, many eyes drifted toward a certain figure standing guard at the edge of the tent. A tall, lithe young woman. Fine-boned features. Healthy color in her cheeks. Her hands occasionally brushed her collarbone or shoulder, as though still surprised to feel flesh and bone where there should have been a mortal wound. Daisy Mormont. A woman everyone in the camp had watched bleed out the night before. Now standing straight, armored, vigilant, looking as if nothing had happened. Impossible. A miracle. Or something far darker. Most preferred not to think too hard about how she lived again. After staring at her one more time, the same Riverlands lord who had earlier tested Charles cleared his throat. If assault fails and allies fail us, perhaps peace is the only path left. Several lords nodded. He's right. The Lannisters sit fat and well supplied in the Riverlands. We, on the other hand, have no resupply and cannot sit here forever. No one is harvesting our fields back home. Imagine what this winter will look like. With the council dragging on for hours, the tone had shifted. Desperation softened resolve. Even former hawks found themselves wavering. At the head of the table, Ned Stark stared at the map in silence, brows tightly knit. He hadn't spoken for a long time. The war faction believed Lord Eddard supported them, but war wasn't won by enthusiasm alone. Consequences mattered. And at this moment, the situation before them was an immense knot no one could easily untie. I have a solution. The calm, steady voice cut through the noise like a blade. All eyes turned toward the speaker. If anyone else had spoken, the lords might have ignored it. Everyone here had offered solutions multiple times. But this man, even Eddard Stark, had to give him weight. Roose Bolton, Lord of the Dread Fort. Cold, calculating, unfailingly effective, the North's most dependable left hand throughout the campaign. What solution does Lord Bolton suggest? Someone asked uneasily. Bolton cast him a glance, then spoke in his usual flat, emotionless tone. From what I know, Tywin hasn't given the imp many proper soldiers. The dwarf is holding Lannisport and the river crossing mostly through the mountain clans he recruited from the Vale. Lord Umber should know that better than anyone. Your forces clashed with them. John Umber snorted. I. Stupid as goats, strong as oxen. One of them dragged me off my horse. Nearly ended me. Others nodded. Their performance during the night raid proves it. Undisciplined, greedy, eager to prove themselves makes them easy to bait. If it were out in the open field, we'd have eaten them alive. Thick skulls, big muscles, that's all they've got. But they are a significant force, Bolton continued, cutting through the mockery. And ever since the dwarf brought even more of them down from the mountains, they've become the core obstacle blocking our way. The Riverlands Lord leaned forward. So Lord Bolton has a way to deal with them. A method, Bolton replied. Perhaps not perfect, but workable. He flicked his eyes toward the corner toward Daisy Mormont, who was absent-mindedly rubbing her shoulder, still marveling at the life she had regained. As far as I know, the mountain clans deeply revere witches and fear sorcery. Last night, everyone here witnessed what true dark magic looks like. Nothing terrifies simple warriors more than what we saw. He paused. We could replicate that spectacle outside Lannisport's gates. The clans are unruly at the best of times. Faced with such a ritual, their morale will collapse. When panic spreads among the defenders, That seems improper, a lord interrupted with hesitation. Yes, last night was horrifying. But frightening several thousand hardened hill fighters into retreat? That sounded like wishful thinking. Another lord mused aloud. The clansfolk are simple, true, but the imp isn't so easily fooled. I think it's worth trying, someone countered. The dwarf alone can't control that many savages if they break. A snort came from the far side of the table. That sounds exactly like something the Dreadfort would propose. Bolton didn't react, but the meaning wasn't lost on anyone. A naked man has few secrets, a flayed man has none. The old saying echoed in minds around the table. Bolton banners had scared off countless foes long before blades were ever drawn. Bolton finally turned toward Eddard. My lord, what is your judgment? Again, all eyes shifted to the old wolf. But before Ned could speak, Lord Cranston is here as a guest of the North, not a tool to be ordered around. The shrill, rasping voice cut through the air. The lords didn't even need to look. Of course Lady Maege Mormont. Ever since Charles had saved her daughter, she had taken it upon herself to be the young mage's shield, sword, and self-appointed advocate. She would tolerate no slight against him. Guest or not, someone replied stiffly, a guest should not stand idle while his hosts bleed. We face a dire situation. I truly hope Lord Cranston heard that, Lord Riswell, Lady Maege snapped venomously. The lord's face shut tight. He looked down and wisely chose silence. Perhaps, someone suggested cautiously, we should simply ask Lord Cranston himself what he thinks. And with that, all eyes in the council shifted toward Charles, waiting to see how the mysterious young outsider would respond. Chapter 49, Chapter 49 An Unreliable Proposal. Chapter 49 An Unreliable Proposal. Miss Roslin, where exactly are we going? Two guards in leather armor, each bearing the twin sigil on their chest, hurried after the young lady, glancing uneasily at the increasingly remote part of the encampment. One finally mustered the courage to ask. To find Sir Cranston, Roslin replied while scanning the area, clearly searching for someone. Cranston. Both guards froze for a moment, exchanging hesitant looks. Back in Lannisport, they hadn't even heard the name. But after fleeing to the Northern Army camp, the soldiers told stories, whispers, rumors, half-believed legends until everyone knew who the Black Sorcerer was. His feats were few, but each one unbelievable. Publicly threatening the Queen in front of the Great September, that alone had become the most shocking tale in the Seven Kingdoms this year. After all, she was second only to the king himself, yet Sir Cranston had forced her hand. And that wasn't even the worst. Every soldier in camp had heard the screams from last night. Though no one saw the ritual, those who were close enough swore the Black Sorcerer used human sacrifice to summon a hellhound wreathed in infernal flame. The Red Keep rescue, the necromancy, the Queen incident, the unholy ritual last night. Some claimed the skeletal hound of the Seven Hells still stalked behind him, ready to devour any who dared stare too long. The army forbade all talk of the sorcerer, but that only made the stories spread faster. Everyone feared him. And everyone was grateful he was on their side. No one wanted someone like that as an enemy, not if they ever wanted to sleep again. Why do you wish to see the Black SA, Sir Cranston? One guard asked nervously. Rosalind frowned. Call him Sir Cranston. That's how the Northerners address him. Then her tone softened again. He saved me during the night raid. Before we leave, I want to thank him, and... Her cheeks flushed scarlet, the rest of her sentence dissolving into embarrassed silence. The two guards exchanged a shocked, horrified look. Our Lady, and the Black Sorcerer? 7 help us. I heard he's somewhere near the corpse grounds. I shouldn't be far off, she murmured as she continued forward. Corpse grounds. The guards shuddered, regretting every life decision that led them here, but they dutifully followed. They didn't have to walk far. Rosalind spotted him first. She quickened her pace, weaving around tents and stepping over a wooden barrier. Then abruptly stopped. Because the scene before her was revolting. Blood pooled across the dirt. White, jelly-like brain matter glistened. Coils of red-green intestine spilled over blackened mud. Filthy yellow fluids soaked into the earth. And crouched amid the carnage was the Black Sorcerer himself. Charles's exposed arms, throat, even a side of his face were wrapped in tiny writhing characters, inky, tadpole-shaped sigils crawling across his skin like living shadows. With the black robe, the runes, and the gore around him, he looked less like a man and more like a demon who had climbed straight out of the 7 hells. He was muttering something over a corpse, indifferent to the nightmare around him. Rosalind recoiled, pale with terror, yet she did not run. She forced herself to stand there, trembling but resolute. Because she had seen him flick his hand, a silent gesture telling her to wait. Her guards, by contrast, bolted several yards away and bent over retching again, hands on their knees, tears in their eyes, an embarrassing sight for men sworn to protect a lady. Rosalind kept her eyes forward, fighting her nausea. After a long moment, she heard a faint sigh. The sorcerer rose, turned around revealing a surprisingly young face, and dusted his blood-stained fingers against his robe. What do you need from me? His voice wasn't gentle, but it wasn't sharp either, low, steady, with a faint magnetic warmth that eased tension almost automatically. But then Rosalind's gaze dropped to his right hand. To the object he was holding. Her heart, which had just loosened a moment before, seized in terror all over again. Rosalind forced herself to swallow her fear and stammered. Thank you for your help the other night, Sir Cranston. No need. It cost me nothing, Charles replied absent-mindedly. He barely spared her a glance, his attention remained fixed on the grey-white organ in his hand. Where on earth is the problem? He muttered, frowning in genuine confusion. His plans for bout training had fallen apart since the blood-for-blood ritual. And any hope of joining the army in real combat had disappeared entirely. There simply weren't any major battles happening, and even if there were, the last thing they'd do was send an attention-grabbing sorcerer into the fray. Charles didn't mind much. Missing a few chances to level up through battle was minor, his real plan, harvesting souls, didn't require him to fight at all. Just following the army around was enough. So these days, he had more free time than ever. Naturally, he began practicing spells he hadn't yet mastered. At the moment, he was working on Evil Eye of Malice, whose chant he'd already converted once, but to his surprise, nothing happened. Did this spell also have a 24-hour expiration? Was it the same kind of rule? If so, then all the runes covering his body were a complete waste of effort, a painful amount of effort, at that. With no mentor, there was simply no way for him to intuit all the hidden rules of magic. He only knew bone resurrection had a 24-hour limit, the rest was a blur. Lost in thought, Charles grew cold and distant enough that the pretty young girl before him felt neglected. But Rosalind didn't take it that way. If anything, his calm response soothed her nerves a little. Her heartbeat slowed from its panicked pace, and she lowered her head, speaking softly. "Lord Stark said he will send us to Winterfell. It's safer there. Once Riverrun is retaken, he'll escort us back. And what does that have to do with me? I don't even know you." Charles gave her an odd sideways glance. "Is that so? Then I wish you a safe journey." "Thank you, my lord," she said earnestly, ignoring his lukewarm tone before continuing. "Lady Melisandre says you are the chosen messenger of the Lord of Light, born with divine power. Since you've offered your blessing, we will surely reach Winterfell safely. I heard there are bandits on the northern road." "Messenger my ass!" Instinctively swearing in silence, Charles suddenly froze. He narrowed his eyes at her. "Wait, you didn't come here to pray to me, did you?" Rosalind turned beet red. "And fled. Immediately. That red woman's brainwashing is way too effective." He stared after the girl's retreating figure, then looked down at the slick, cold, nauseating human eyeball in his hand. He had no words. He practiced for a long time, with absolutely no results. Eventually Charles gave up in defeat, wiped his hands clean, and headed back to his new tent. But today simply refused to be peaceful. As soon as he returned, he spotted a familiar head of red hair waiting outside. Robb Stark. And beside him, the ever-expressionless Lord Roose Bolton, whose face was such a blank slate Charles suspected he might be physically incapable of emotion. "Good day, Sir Cranston." "Good day, Robb." "Lord Bolton." After exchanging greetings, the three stepped into the tent. Only then did Charles ask, puzzled. "So? What's this about?" Robb glanced at the black runes still fading from Charles's face and, suppressing a shiver, said solemnly, "There is something we hope to ask your help with. It isn't urgent, but—" Charles nodded in understanding and went to wash his hands in the basin. As he wiped the ink-like runes from his skin, Robb began explaining, recounting Bolton's proposal from the military council. Charles listened in silence. When he finished cleaning up, he dried his face and summarized. "So your situation is basically this: you're all stuck outside the battlefield while your allies and forces inside get chewed apart, and you can't break through." Before Robb could answer, Bolton cut in. "Once we retake the crossing, we can advance." Charles stroked his chin. "And your plan is to have me scare the defenders so badly they don't dare fight back?" "Not quite," Bolton said, perfectly deadpan. "We only need their morale shattered. If they panic, the attack will cost far fewer lives. Of course, if they truly refuse to fight back, that would be ideal." Charles rolled his eyes. "That's impossible. Why wouldn't someone fight back when they're attacked? They'd have to be idiots." "The dwarf is certainly no idiot," Bolton conceded. "But his troops are savages. Real savages. You cannot imagine how unreasonable they can be. I have examined the plan carefully, its chances are considerable." He began counting on his fingers. "Stone crows, burned men, moon brothers, painted dogs, milk snakes. They may have helped the dwarf take the city, but aside from raiding and killing, they are utterly useless." Robb nodded. "Please don't overestimate the minds of mountain clansmen, Sir Cranston. If they saw you, they'd soil their britches. Unless I learn some kind of mass idiot-making curse, I refuse to believe that," Charles muttered. Still, he didn't refuse. It wasn't a difficult request. He didn't believe he could scare them into complete paralysis, but he could certainly shake their morale. And if that was all they needed? He didn't mind lending a hand. "Curious," he asked. "So everyone agrees with this? Your father as well?" "Father insists on crossing the river by building a bridge," Robb said. "But he didn't reject Lord Bolton's idea. If the effect is strong, he'll approve the assault. He only ruled out using Northmen for the ritual." Robb hesitated, then added, "Please trust in your impact, Sir Cranston." Truly. Ever since that night, most soldiers won't even go near your tent. Even my wolf won't approach you. Charles glanced outside at the hulking grey dire wolf lingering far beyond the tent. And what is that supposed to prove? Plenty, Rob said seriously. That wolf has killed more men than I have. He fears no one. But he fears you. So I'm not normal, is that it? Charles muttered, rolling his eyes again. But he didn't dwell on it. Instead, he asked. What do I need to prepare? Rob exhaled in relief. We'll provide whatever you require, including the candidates. We'll station guards around you. You'll be safe. The flayed man lord added helpfully. I recommend you be as cruel as possible. If you can shatter them in one go, that would be ideal. Cruel. Yes. Something visually horrifying. For example. Charles listened to Bolton's detailed, disturbingly enthusiastic explanation. Slowly, he nodded. So basically, you want me to put on a terrifying show in front of the entire city. Chapter 50, Chapter 50 Tyrion. Chapter 50 Tyrion. A cool breeze brushed past the battlements. Standing on tiptoe, the little man peered over the stone parapet, watching the roaring river surge past the base of the castle. Then he turned to the black-haired, dark-eyed sellsword beside him. My father once tried to turn old Frey against that wolf pup, then bring the crafty fossil over to our side. Unfortunately, Eddard Stark's escape ruined any chance of success. Isn't the current situation even better? The sellsword asked. Desperate gambles aren't father's usual style. This whole business isn't nearly as pretty as it looks. Tyrion shrugged. And honestly, what's so wonderful about war? Shame Lord Bolton rejected our little suggestion. We could have ended this conflict early. Well, as things stand, I wager you'll be the ones to win in the end, the sellsword said. Especially after you took this city. This place is crucial. Tyrion cast a glance over his shoulder at the crossing, smiling faintly. House Frey soared from obscurity in a few centuries and became one of the most powerful noble houses in Westeros just by owning this bridge. A vast treasure, the sellsword murmured, licking his lips. You're truly willing to hand it over to those mountain tribes? Of course. That was the bargain. And what about the Frey prince? The sellsword snorted with open mockery. Rhaegar Frey. Tyrion chuckled. He was a Frey. Now look how many Freys are even left alive? There were far too many of those weasel-faced creatures anyway. People instinctively dislike those of us born ugly, you understand, so I suppose he did everyone a favor. But do you really think my father will leave such an important stronghold in the hands of a man like him? But he helped you take this treasure. And he'll be rewarded appropriately. Just, not with this. Tyrion turned back toward the horizon. Far away, smoke rose from a sprawling camp like faint grey ribbons. Morning mist clung to the tents and training fields. From this distance, the thousands of troops looked like ants moving inside a hazy mirage. I once accompanied King Robert to Winterfell as a guest, Tyrion recalled. Eddard Stark seldom smiled. He showed Robert an occasional warm expression, but even then, the man was mostly stone-faced. To everyone else, including my darling sister, he seemed cold or dismissive. So we Lannisters never cared for him. And Catelyn Tully, gods, that woman had a temper. He chuckled. Though I admit, his bastard boy was rather interesting. See? Lannisters dislike Starks, Starks want Lannisters dead, and before you know it, war. That's all war ever is. War makes plenty of people rich, the sellsword said cheerfully. Otherwise you wouldn't be here. If Jaime hadn't been captured, do you think I'd have gotten my turn at glory? Tyrion scoffed. Father dangled a rope and told me to climb these walls on my tiny legs, seize the city, then face a pack of snarling wolves. Tell me, does that sound like a delightful opportunity? At least now he's not complaining about my short arms and legs, Tyrion added. That part is a pleasant change. Success tends to hush criticism, the sellsword said lightly. Oh, spare me. The risks were enormous. If not for those clansmen, I'd have been killed in last night's little uprising. Tyrion rubbed his neck, still uneasy. The clans were notoriously undisciplined, reckless in everything. Last night, remnants of House Frey launched a surprise attack, using their knowledge of the city's layout. In the confusion, one man nearly took Tyrion's head clean off. And without the clansmen, you wouldn't have gotten in at all even if someone opened the gate. The sellsword countered dryly. As if summoned by their words, a towering figure emerged from the gatehouse. A hulking man in ragged hides, long brown hair hanging wild, his warped features making him look more monster than man. Shagga of the Stone Crows. He hauled a huge wooden barrel across the battlements and stopped in front of them. With a loud thud, he dropped it at Tyrion's feet and roared. Son of Dolph is a warrior. Not your errand slave. Tyrion's face received a full shower of mountain man spit. The sellsword snickered. Seems your savage can't tell the difference between carry this up here and find a servant to carry this up here. Then I suppose I wasn't clear enough. Tyrion wiped his face calmly and looked up. All right, Shagga. As thanks, I've arranged for a few goats for you so you won't run out of animals to feed when you remove other men's manhoods. The insult hit home. Shagga's snarl melted away, and curiosity crept into his voice. Half-man found goats? Where? The crossing has everything, my friend. Tyrion stepped to the barrel, lifted the lid, and peeked inside. What is that? The sellsword asked, leaning in. Every 2 days he saw one of these delivered to Tyrion's tent, but never learned what was inside. A special charm maiden's first blood mixed with herbs and a dozen odd things. Recipe from an ugly witch in Lanny Sport. Tyrion dipped his fingers in casually. Whole barrel of it. Care for some? As Tyrion reached for his body to smear it on, Bronn immediately leapt backward in horror. 7 hells, have you lost your mind? The stench rising from Tyrion's body was a rancid mix of blood and musk. He wrinkled his nose in disgust, yet his hands never stopped smearing the sticky red paste over himself. They say this stuff can ward off sorcery, Tyrion explained. Even Lord Varys swore by it and sent a raven warning us. After what happened in King's Landing, I doubt that absurd tale was a lie. One never knows. Go to sleep one night and wake up with a mage holding your favorite appendage hostage. Of course, if said mage were a lovely young lady, the situation wouldn't be entirely hopeless. He glanced at Bronn. Sure you don't want some? No thanks. I'm just a nobody, no sorcerer's going to bother with me. Bronn dodged out of reach, pinching his nose. Then something occurred to him, and he stiffened. So, what about Lord Tywin? You think my dear father isn't terrified of that black sorcerer? Tyrion grinned. The old man cherishes his life more than anyone. I learned this trick from him. He kept smearing. In moments he was covered head to toe in the glistening, foul-smelling mixture. The guards on the rampart instinctively backed away several paces, keeping very safe distance. Bronn simply stared at him, utterly dumbfounded. Thinking of the dignified, immaculate, terrifying Lord Tywin Lannister coded in this was a vision Bronn's mind refused to accept. You're going to be the laughingstock of the 7 kingdoms, he muttered, close to groaning. Kingdoms already full of rumors, Lannisters are the punchline of half of them, Tyrion said cheerfully. And who dares spread gossip about this? Besides, it's effective. None of us have fallen for that sorcerer's tricks like my foolish sister did. If your commander ends up bewitched, how are you supposed to fight a war? His grotesque appearance didn't seem to bother him in the slightest. Bronn said nothing for a long while. When he finally looked at Tyrion again, his eyes held pity. Power had its privileges but also its burdens. Half-man saw black sorcerer before. Shagga suddenly lumbered up beside them, voice full of nervous curiosity. When he wasn't angry, the brute was almost endearingly simple. "No, but I hear he's young and easy to recognize." Tyrion tilted his head toward Bronn. "Who knows, might even be one of your long-lost relatives. Both of you share the same dark hair, dark eyes. If my family weren't all dead, I might almost believe you." Bronn snorted. He was about to say more when he froze, gaze shifting toward the fields beyond the walls. His brows drew down. "If I'm not mistaken, that man approaching is your black sorcerer." Tyrion whipped his head around, gripping the crenellation with both hands. After squinting into the distance, he let out a low whistle. "Well, look at that. Rumors really are dangerous. He's not black at all, he's paler than milk. And prettier than the top girl at Chita's brothel," Bronn murmured, rubbing his chin. "Could probably make more money than the top girl too. Dolph's son Shagga will chop off his manroot and feed it to goats," the clansman huffed, glaring down the field. Now that he'd seen the dreaded sorcerer, all his earlier unease had evaporated. "Feeding it to goats seems wasteful. Take it to King's Landing, some fool might pay good coin for a mage's trophy." Tyrion and his companions were still laughing crudely among themselves when the events on the field abruptly silenced them all. "What are they doing?" someone asked, but no one answered. Every man on the wall went still, eyes fixed on the scene outside. Out beyond bowshot, just at the edge of range, several figures stopped. They bent to their tasks, arranging items around the cloaked young man at their center. A stone slab inscribed with tangled carvings was set onto the ground. Strange objects were placed beside it. Then a ragged man, bound, filthy, cursing wildly, was dragged forward by two soldiers, forced onto the slab, and held down. Under the sorcerer's quiet command, the horror began. A soldier knelt, lifted hammer and spike and drove the first iron nail through the man's arm. Blood spurted across the slab. Screams mingled with curses. Nail after nail hammered into flesh, until all four limbs were pinned. Even from 300 meters away, the sight was hideously clear. A low, cold chant threaded through the wind. The bound man's furious cursing turned instantly into shrill, animalistic screams. Pain. Madness. Begging. The eerie chanting rose, fell, twisted until the spectacle became nightmarishly surreal. The final spike was driven into the man's throat and chest junction. His screams faltered. But the ritual did not end. If anything, it had barely begun. Under the sun, the man's blood-drained skin darkened rapidly. His body shriveled as though collapsing inward, moisture vanishing, flesh sinking. In moments, the burly captive transformed into a hunched, withered old husk. The chanting intensified. Then, with a final shudder, the man became a mummified corpse stretched grotesquely over the stone. The river wind blew across its desiccated face. Those hollowed, sunken eyes seemed to stare directly at the battlements of the crossing. Tyrion fell silent. His blood-smeared clothes fluttered in the wind. Bronn swallowed hard, clutching the hilt of his sword. The mountain clansmen on the wall gaped in mute terror. And then, the young man in the black cloak raised a hand to his own throat and traced a slow, meaningful slash across it. He smiled pleasantly, turned around, and walked away. Dash. A long, suffocating stillness settled over the walls. The faint sounds of the river and the distant murmur of the city seemed unbearably far away. Shagga swallowed loudly. His massive frame trembled. Dolph's son Shagga, K kinda wants to pee. Chapter 51, Chapter 51 Game Rules. Chapter 51 Game Rules. Dolph's son Shagga. Shagga thinks he needs to piss. The words shattered the suffocating silence. Instinctively, every pair of eyes turned toward the hulking clansman beside Tyrion. Yet no one laughed. The lingering horror in their chests made the sentiment feel painfully relatable. Right now, every face on the battlements was pale with fear. Men looked at one another, opening their mouths to speak only to discover there were no words left in them. At last, someone whispered, barely audible, almost a groan. Did the black sorcerer curse us? Von Sun Von doesn't want to become a dried corpse. Rum Sun Rum neither. Rum Sun Rum has not lived enough yet. The murmurs grew louder, then louder still, until the wall was abuzz with nervous shouting. Even the Lannister-trained soldiers looked shaken, whispering to each other with the same haunted eyes. Speculations and wild fears spread like wildfire. Tyrion, who moments ago felt the same dread, snapped back to himself. This was bad. Very bad. If panic spiraled here, the whole city would boil over. Shut it down, he barked. No one spreads a word of this. Seal the gossip. But the clansmen were not exactly paragons of discipline. By late afternoon, every mountain tribesman in the city knew. The tale had mutated as it traveled. The north had brought a mighty sorcerer. He had laid a curse outside the walls. Those struck by it would shrivel into husks. Witnesses dramatically recounted what they had seen, eyes wide, voices trembling, each retelling more vivid and grotesque than the last, as though sharing the horror might free them from it. By nightfall, the entire city was infected by the rumor. Black sorcerer cursed Riverrun crossing, soon the trident will swallow the whole city. He cursed the crossing. Everyone inside will be drained into corpses. He cursed. Exaggeration fanned the flames. A single gruesome ritual turned into stories of dozens slain, hundreds, thousands. The Black Mage was now said to be unleashing clouds of shadow like storm fronts, preparing to obliterate Riverrun crossing and uproot Lannister rule entirely. The surviving Frey loyalists lurking in the shadows seized the chance. They whispered everywhere. This calamity is the Lannisters' fault. They angered the sorcerer. To escape the curse, we must drive them out. A few listened. Most did not. The mountain clans were too violent, and unpredictable rebellion would only earn brutal retaliation. But fear had a way of working its own poison. By the end of the day, the city felt unnaturally quiet. Petty crime plummeted. Many refused to leave their homes. Children were locked indoors. When the nightly curfew fell, not a single soul walked the streets. Even passing clouds were interpreted as omens of an impending doom. The timid cried at the slightest breeze. In just one day, Riverrun crossing had become a city trembling in its own skin. The next morning, the young man in the black cloak rode out from the northern camp once more. Surrounded by soldiers, he approached the edge of Lannister bow range at a steady, unhurried pace. The moment the sentries recognized him, one of them shrieked in panic. Tyrion, startled by the shout, looked up and his blood ran cold. Bronn. Archers have them shoot him. Arrows can't reach that far, Bronn muttered. And even if they could look at all those tower shields. They were ready for it. Then use the catapults. If arrows won't reach, throw rocks at him. If we had catapults, I would, Bronn said wearily. The crossing only has scorpions. Then use the scorpions. They won't pierce those shields. Also, the scorpions were destroyed. Destroyed? By who? Your tribesmen. Bronn shrugged. They smashed them when they seized the walls. Said they'd lost too many cousins to them. Not good things, apparently. Tyrion released Bronn's tunic, his face darkening. Watching the cloaked figure draw nearer, anxiety churned like a storm in his gut. He already knew exactly what was coming. If I send men out to strike now, what are our chances? He asked quietly. Assuming anyone here will obey your orders. Bronn snorted, gesturing at the wall. Look at them. They're terrified out of their wits. Tyrion scanned the battlements. Dozens of wild-eyed clansmen shrank back from the parapet, whispering, praying, shaking. His heart sank. Still, he wasn't ready to give up. Maybe I can talk some sense into them. He squared his shoulders and marched toward the nearest squad of mountain men. He returned less than a minute later, looking utterly defeated. Up on the walls, panic had already overtaken reason. The clansmen erupted into frenzied shouting the moment they spotted the black-cloaked figure approaching once again. Word of the black sorcerer's return spread through the wall guard long before Tyrion could rein in the rumors. Those mountain clansmen who hadn't witnessed yesterday's horror were skeptical at first, unwilling to believe their comrades' trembling retellings. Yet curiosity gnawed at them. And curiosity, mixed with fear, proved far stronger than Tyrion's strict orders. Soon, the battlements filled with broad-shouldered tribesmen, eyes wide, half terrified and half fascinated, all staring at the supposedly frail young man approaching outside the walls. They no longer sneered at the pale pretty-faced outsider the way some chieftains had on the first day. Not after yesterday. Under dozens of uneasy gazes, blood-stained skeletons clawed themselves free from over 10 corpses. Soldiers shoved the torn-open husks, ragged skin, spilled intestines, filth, greenish-yellow organs, and brain matter like grey jelly off the stone platform. Everything tumbled into the river below, swept away by the fierce current of the trident. Is the black sorcerer releasing his bone warriors to sneak into the city and kill us? The question came from Shagga, who had somehow materialized beside Tyrion again. He stared at the drifting remains, following every floating organ with horrified fascination until his gaze drifted down to the moat beneath their feet. "Relax," Tyrion muttered, resigned. "My method will keep you safe." He pointed at his own foul-smelling, blood-smeared clothes. "Dolph's son will not bathe in that filthy stuff." Shagga snorted, glaring nervously at the ritual outside. His steps wobbled as he backed away. On Tyrion's other side, a young chieftain with brown hair and a single remaining eye touched the empty socket instinctively. Terror flickered across his scarred face. Tyrion didn't notice the expression. He didn't need to. With last night's chain reaction still fresh, he already knew, today's spectacle would spread even faster. He was furious and helpless. Furious because the clansmen refused to obey anything. They didn't listen, didn't care, didn't recognize any authority but their own whims. Helpless because of the calm figure outside the walls, the black cloak at the center of the circle of soldiers. Tyrion prided himself on intellect, cunning, and influence. He had always believed these were enough to survive anything. Even as a dwarf, he'd carved out space through wit alone. But before this inexplicable sorcerer, his strengths felt like glass candles, fragile, flickering, useless. "The rules of the game have changed." He muttered the words as he descended the battlements, troubled to the core. And right on cue, by noon the rumors had exploded. The black sorcerer had unleashed undead warriors inside the city. They were slaughtering mountain clansmen in the dark. As the panic grew, it somehow became true. Clansmen started turning up dead, most torn apart horribly, heads severed, bodies ripped open, hearts missing. Whether done by frightened clansmen killing each other, by Frey loyalists, or by opportunistic criminals, no one knew. Chaos devoured the crossing. Day 3. Under guard, Tyrion trudged toward the walls at dawn. Along the streets, streams of tribesmen, filthy, broad-shouldered, nervous, were heading the same way. He could do nothing to stop them. Punishment? Bribes? Threats? Reason? None of it mattered. Compared to real sorcery, his authority meant nothing. Last night's meeting with the clan chiefs had been a catastrophe. He'd raised his voice slightly and they'd screamed insults at him for minutes. Tyrion had never felt so angry. Or so powerless. "Are you with House Lannister or with the damned sorcerer? Use your heads. Calm down. It helps all of us." He'd said it. He'd meant it. They hadn't listened. All night, they whispered superstitiously about the sorcerer. Every mention of his existence made them tense up like startled deer, making Tyrion's stomach sink lower and lower. At this rate, if the enemy attacks. Lost in grim thought, he barely noticed the scuffle in the alley until shouting tore through his haze. "Karsur's son Das will crush your skull, you stupid milk snake dog! Sala's son will kick your eggs first, you stinking, soon-to-be eggless howler! The tribes were brawling again, howlers versus milk snakes this time. Tension had them all on edge. Normally Tyrion welcomed inter-tribal fights, they made controlling them easier. But now? Now it only deepened his despair. The enemy isn't even at the gates yet, and they're already tearing each other apart. He climbed onto the battlements. In the misty morning light, the Black Sorcerer appeared again right on schedule. He had considered ordering men to mount a surprise attack and kill the mage once and for all. But even his Lannister-trained soldiers balked at the idea, terrified they'd be drained to husks or turned into skeleton puppets. Tyrion hated it. But he understood. There was risk. Who knew whether the sorcerer could drain 100 men in an instant? He suspected the mage was bluffing, repeating his display for intimidation. But suspicion wasn't enough to gamble with his remaining soldiers. And even if he gave the order, the sorcerer was on horseback. They'd never catch him. The third ritual mirrored the first. But instead of leaving afterward, the black mage poured a bucket of shimmering, multicolored liquid into the river. The hues spread across the surface like oil, only to be swallowed again by the current, drifting silently toward the moat. Combined with the gruesome corpse ritual moments earlier, the sight was eerie beyond belief. The clansmen, who had watched stiffly for minutes, suddenly erupted. But instead of fear, they reached a decision. These 7 Kingdom stone houses stink. Sala's son is going home. Kuru's son also wants to go home. Too many fools, too many smells, mountains better. Bring Gundor's son. We go together. There's too much stuff to carry. Let's burn the stone house city. Easier. Tim's son thinks that's a good idea. Chaos exploded across the wall. Their desire to leave spread like wildfire. Within minutes, the entire mountain host was shouting, arguing, packing. Some grabbed torches and set fires across the city, ignoring Tyrion's desperate orders. After being reprimanded, they cursed at the Lannister officers instead, even shoving them. After all, Lannister had promised them the city. If they were leaving, why should they leave their spoils for outsiders? Dolph's son Shagga is also going home, the giant told Tyrion cheerfully as the dwarf tried to salvage the situation. After battle, you visit me. We feed goats together. Also, the goats you gave me, I cannot carry them. Bring them to me later. Take special care of the grey-hoofed nanny goat. Don't let her get sick. Tend your goats, my ass, Tyrion thought, face twitching. He begged. He pleaded. It changed nothing. Shagga slung a huge pack over his shoulder, tied treasure-laden horses together, waved at Tyrion, and led the stone crows out through the south gate, laughing the whole time. Their expressions? Like men finally escaping hell for heaven. No one dared stop them. Not after weeks of seeing their brutality firsthand. Once the stone crows left, the rest followed. Burned men, Blackears, Howlers, Red Forges, every clan packed up, cursed the city, and marched south for the Mountains of the Moon. By dusk, barely 200 Lannister soldiers remained. And Riverrun, crossing a fortress won through blood and cunning, was about to collapse entirely. The Frey loyalists, sensing weakness, surged out of hiding. Chaos exploded. The remaining Lannister garrison fought to suppress riots, but the city spiraled further into madness. At sunset, seeing the city hollowed out, the Northern Army launched its assault. They took Riverrun Crossing in under an hour, losing fewer than 10 men. A siege that had trapped them for half a month shattered as easily as glass. Every Northern lord stood dumbfounded. Chapter 52, Chapter 52, Entering the City. Chapter 52, Entering the City. The noon sun baked the earth, making the air above the river shimmer. A cool breeze rose off the water, brushing across the faces of soldiers crossing the drawbridge and drawing soft sighs of relief from their lips. The shadow of war, so heavy only the night before, had evaporated with their sudden victory. The last few pockets of resistance splashed weakly in the river and were gone. The northern host had seized the twins. The soldiers who arrived first threw open the gates, ushering in wave after wave of support troops. People of all trades and garb filtered cheerfully inside, chatting, laughing, stretching their weary limbs. Charles was among them. Despite being pivotal to the victory, he hadn't taken part in the final assault. He'd been ordered to remain far in the rear, so only after the chaos was fully suppressed did he finally step into the stone fortress built upon the river. The twins are actually two castles, a booming voice beside him explained. One on each bank, the north and the south. Between them runs this great stone bridge across the Green Fork. Hundreds of years ago, everything here was wood bridge and fortresses both. Only after the phrase grew rich off tolls did they replace everything with stone. The speaker was a round-faced, bald-headed mountain of a man, Wendell Manderley of White Harbor. His father was too old for war, so the Manderley family answered Rob's summons with only 2 sons. Wendell's older brother had already been captured in an earlier battle, which left Wendell as the sole Manderley in the host. Perhaps due to his size, he hadn't participated in last night's fighting, and only lumbered in this morning. Despite his imposing bulk, he had a gentle nature, soft-spoken and unfailingly polite. He chatted easily with Charles and showed no unusual discomfort around him. Compared to the common soldiers, the northern lords were far less frightened of Charles. They encountered him often, in everyday moments. The black sorcerer behaved like an ordinary if slightly odd young man. And most of these lords were old enough to be his father. Some even had grandsons his age. After repeated contact, the strangeness faded, and so did the instinctive fear. Unlike the rank-and-file soldiers, none of the lords trembled to speak to him. The phrase ancestors had foresight, Charles murmured, peering curiously around the corridors. After arriving in this medieval world, he'd seen surprisingly few castles up close. The stark stone hallways still held a novelty that tugged at his curiosity. Perfectly ordinary, yet the soldiers around them reacted as if a ghost had drifted past. Each time Charles's eyes swept over someone, they jerked their gazes downward, shoulders stiff with terror. One poor soldier panicked so hard he tripped over his own feet and crashed face first onto the floor, provoking a burst of laughter. But the moment they remembered who was present, the laughter died in their throats. "Am I really that terrifying?" Charles sighed. No, of course not," Wendell stammered. "That soldier must simply be, easily startled." Anyone could see he didn't quite believe his own words. Charles didn't mind. Fear could breed hatred, but it could also cleave straight into the soul like a sharpened blade. And wrapped in the mantle of the black sorcerer, Charles found many things became much easier to accomplish. For example, the unexpected battle yesterday. He cast a sympathetic glance at the fallen soldier, then continued walking without a care. Wendell rode beside him as they headed toward the main keep. But Charles slowed after only a few steps. Something had caught his attention. A woman in a flowing crimson gown. Copper-red curls fell in soft waves over her shoulders. The ruby at her throat shimmered in the sunlight, its glow strangely hypnotic. Charles instinctively recognized it wasn't ordinary. A faint notification glimmered before his eyes. A ruby filled with unknown power. But even that gemstone paled next to its owner. She stood among the crowd like a scarlet flame, elegant, poised, lips moving in a serene cadence as she addressed those gathered around her. "The Lord of Light bathes his children in radiance. And darkness is his scourge, his whip, his blade against evil. As his servant, Sir Charles Cranston came not to destroy, but to save. It was he who freed the innocents of this city from Lannister oppression and the cruelty of wild men. It was he who rescued your lord's greatest ally, Eddard Stark, from the capital. He walks through the night bearing the boundless power of the Lord of Light, and that power now reaches toward you with benevolence. Black sorcerer is merely the slander of the ignorant, fear twisted into lies by our enemies, temptations whispered by false gods to hinder the Lord's chosen." Her voice flowed like warm wine, soothing, persuasive, dangerously convincing. Charles stared, expression growing complicated. The crowd had gathered tightly around Melisandre, hanging on her every word. From time to time someone would raise a question, and the Red Priestess would answer with patience and solemn poise, kind, yet never truly approachable. Every movement carried an air of untouchable authority. She was, in every sense, a masterful zealot, someone who knew exactly which posture, which tone, and which mystery would most effectively sway the ignorant. And ignorant they were. 90% of this world, Charles had learned, couldn't even recognize their own names in writing. Knowledge was a luxury kept under lock and key, hoarded by the few and never shared with the many. It was no wonder Charles often felt baffled by the strange ways people thought. Like the incident a few days ago, he'd only meant to scare a few people into wedding themselves. He never imagined they'd panic so hard they'd abandon an entire city. Ridiculous, absurd, and yet, it happened. Now he watched a different brand of absurdity, Melisandre's flowery nonsense, confident, elaborate, dripping with mystique, and the crowd swallowed every word as if she were reciting divine truth. Some even began murmuring prayers under their breath. And then, as Charles approached, something he hadn't felt in a very long time appeared. Normal human interaction. Great messenger, will you bless my mother with a long life? A tiny girl, 3, maybe 4, looked up at him with wide blue eyes. Brown hair, tattered grey dress, dirt smudged across her cheeks, and bare feet on filthy stone. Her appearance said everything about her life. At her age, she knew no fear. And that childlike innocence, sudden and earnest, caught him completely off guard. He looked at her, then at the young woman holding her hand, then at the cluster of frightened yet hopeful refugees watching him. And for the first time in a while, Charles forced himself to say something he didn't mean. Yes. I will. The girl beamed. Charles attempted a smile that felt painfully stiff and immediately pulled Melisandre out of the crowd by the arm. Once they had moved far enough away, he scanned the area, then muttered. I've been wondering why you insist on sticking to me. I think I've finally figured it out. You're using my name to preach your Lord of Light nonsense. This brings you no harm, Melisandre replied calmly. He had expected excuses, some flowery, mystical justification. Instead, she sounded perfectly righteous. Charles let out a sharp laugh. You're unbelievable. I want people terrified enough to wet themselves when they see me. And you think turning me into a saint helps? All I see are downsides. Downsides. Her red eyes shimmered faintly. Are you truly unbothered by being feared, shunned, hated? Why would I care? Fear is a perfectly good weapon,